Hi everyone. Happy New Year. Just trying to figure out, check whether the live connection, whether the stream is on, because on YouTube Studio I'm not seeing myself, so just give me a couple of moments to get everything set up over here. Okay, so we're live. And so what we're gonna do today is, well, after a month, I have managed to put together part 15 of our Vampire Survivor series. Which, oh dear, I just closed it. Which you will see if you head over to our main blog page. And so this article basically covers the weapon system revamp that I've been working on for the past 6 coding streams, I guess. So it's a really long article, and right now it's released for free. The reason it's released for free is because we are going to take some time to put the video together before we can release it. So part 15 is, if you just head into the article and you just look at the entire table of contents for the article, right? It's really long. So it's about probably 3 or 4 parts worth of content, and the reason that there is this much content is because as I was doing the revamp, I was trying to split it up into multiple parts, but then there wasn't a way to do that. So because if we split it up, then everything will be disjointed and you wouldn't see a final product. So for example, in the table of contents right here, we have 17 parts, right? And then only up to the 12th part do you get to see something. The rest of the part is just us modifying code and creating new data structures. A lot of it is creating new data structures and explaining why these data structures are created. So there was no way for me to split up the part and have the whole part still be coherent, which is why I wrote everything out in a gigantic part. So today what this stream is going to do is it's going to go through this article, and then I'm just gonna explain the logic behind why certain parts are done certain ways, why do we create certain data structures, etc. And of course, throughout this stream, we will also cover how to use this new weapon system that we have created. So what I've done here is I've restored my project all the way back. I've rolled back my project all the way back to when before the weapon system was revamped. So we're gonna start from here, and I'm gonna go through the article and implement the changes one by one. And well, we're also gonna be using this footage. We're gonna be cutting this stream up, and then we're gonna put everything together into a video, and we're gonna roll it out as part 50. So at the end of this video, we will have a revamped weapon system. This will hopefully be the last big part that we have, because it's not good for my sanity if we keep rolling out parts like that. We revamp one thing after another, because it's a lot of work and it's really difficult to explain all these things. Well, I wouldn't say it's difficult, but it's tedious because so many files have changed, right? And you know, I have to go through the logic behind why these changes are made. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started. So I'm gonna be referring to the article as I go along. So this article is gonna be free until the 14th of January. The reason for that is because we're targeting to release the video for part 15 before the 14th. So after the video is released, this article will become a paid piece of content, and you will have to join our Patreon to be able to access it. So the other thing that I mentioned in this little chunk of text over here is that this is going to be a very long part, but this is also going to be a very rewarding part for those of you who have been following our series for some time now. The reason for that is because a lot of programming is, a lot of it is just organization. Once you get to a certain level, once you are familiar with, for example, how to debug errors and what functions are, what classes are, and all that stuff, right? And what, say, things like overloading and static, which Xavier explained in the earlier parts of this series. So if you understand all these structures that you have to work with as a programmer, the next step that you want to take to go from being a good programmer to a great programmer is you want to understand how to organize your codes. So if you organize your codes well, then it's going to be very easy for you to create content for your game or for your project, because well-organized code is very easy to manage. And then when your content scales, when you have, say, in Vampire Survivors, a lot of weapons, if your coding is well done, it's going to be very easy for you to create more and more and more and more and more weapons. Whereas if the data structures that you have, that you've set up for your project isn't good, as you create more weapons, you will find things get more and more confusing. So this part, for those of you, again, who've been following the series, it's going to be very eye-opening for you, because it shows you how you can better organize your data with all the codes and the data structures that we are creating, how you can better organize your data so that it becomes very easy for us to create a whole bunch of weapons for this series. So personally, I've learned how to do this because, well, the first engine that I used was Unreal Engine 3. That was more than 10 years ago, 10 to 12 years ago when I was a student. And one of the things that I find programming classes do not teach you that well is how do you structure your classes. And really, I don't blame these classes, because there really isn't a way for you to teach these things. You just have to look at the code bases that someone else has done to see how they organize their data, and then you will have to collect your knowledge from there. So way back when we were in the Unreal Engine 3 days, for Unreal Engine 3 was a lot harder to use than Unity, because you had to go in and edit their source code if you wanted to create your own game. So when I was editing their source code to create my own game, well, for a school project, I saw a lot of how they organize their code, and that 1 year where I had to learn Unreal Engine just by reading their source code, because there was no documentation. Like if you look at Unity, right? Okay, if you just go to the Unity scripting API, you will see that there's so much documentation in Unity that teaches you how to use all the various classes that Unity has available to you. So let me just find, for example, the rigid body component of Unity. So there's so much documentation of how the rigid body can be used. Alright, so for example, your body's different functions like add force, what does it do? Add force in position, add torque, which gives you a rotating force, etc, etc. Right? There's so many functions over here. You can click in and then you can find more examples of how to use the functions. Alright, in Unreal there wasn't such a thing. So what did I do for Unreal when there was no documentation? Well, I had to... Okay, let me just get Visual Studio open. There we go. So because there wasn't documentation for Unreal, right? So what I had to do was the equivalent of, if I had to right click over here and then just go to definition, I had to read the source code like that, right? And the source code for Unreal is some of it is in C++, some of it is in, they had a script called Unreal script. So I just had to read through their functions, and then in Unity the functions that you have for the native scripts are in C++, so you don't get to see the source code. But in Unreal, some of it you get to see the functions, the contents of the function. So I had to read all of these things to get all the functions that I needed to use for the game. So just by reading through how they organize their functions, it taught me a lot about how I should organize my projects when I develop a game. And later on, because I also do web development later on, whatever I've done in Unreal also translated over to what I needed to learn for JavaScript, for PHP, etc., etc. So from Unreal, by reading source code, I learned that can pick up a lot of stuff from seeing how other people organize their codes, which is the motivating factor behind why I chose to reorganize code for Vampire Survivors, because I thought that if I reorganized the code and I ran through it in one part of the series, it would be very helpful for those of you who are aspiring to code bigger and more complex games. So let's get started. So the main idea behind this part 15 over here, is that it was quite cumbersome for us to create weapons in our Vampire Survivors project. So we've had a couple of Patreons email in to ask us how to create new features, new weapons, or like, for example, evolving characters and so on. And then as we went through that, one of the things that I saw in the project was that we could have organized our weapon system much better. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's head over to Unity. So if you wanted to create a new weapon, for example, so let's head over to let's say we want to create a new knife weapon. Let me just reduce the volume of the background music here. If you wanted to create a new knife weapon, we have to go into scriptable objects, weapons, and then let's say go to knife weapon. Okay, so in Vampire Survivors, different weapons have different levels. So I would have to create one scriptable object for every level of the knife, and then I would have to link these scriptable objects to the prefabs of the knife, as well as, let me just go back to that other folder. I would have to link the prefab for the first level, and then I have to link the prefab for the next level. And then I would have to create a new prefab for the other level as well. And it's just because, so like for example, our knife has 8 levels, right? So if we were to create all the 8 levels for our knife, we would have 8 prefabs, and then we would also have 8 scriptable objects. That is just a lot of code that we have to run on. So 8 levels for the knife, which means 8 levels for the knife, weapon, scriptable objects. 8 of these scriptable objects. So we have 16 objects just for one weapon. And then that's not including the scripts that we would have to create. So we would have to also create a knife controller, which controls the cooldown and everything, just mainly the cooldown and attacking of the knife, as well as we would also have to create a new behavior script which controls the projectile. So that is 8 prefabs, 8 scriptable objects, 2 scripts. Okay, that's not counting our parent classes, which we had a melee weapon behavior, projectile weapon behavior. So these are just all the base classes that we'll be using to create the controller scripts and then the projectile scripts for our knife. So that's 18 files plus 3 parent classes. That's 21 files, but it's not really fair for us to count the parent files as files. So we have 18 files just for one weapon. So the idea behind this weapon system revamp is to make it so that we only need one file. Okay, one file and maybe 1 or 2 scripts to create a new weapon with. Okay, so I wanted to change the interface, which was all spread across multiple prefabs and data files. Let me just change my screen over here. So I wanted to update the weapon system so that our weapon system data files will not be spread across multiple data and prefab files. Again, if we want to have 8 levels of a knife, for example, we would have to have 8 prefabs and 8 data files. It's a lot of files. So instead of that, what we want to do is we want all our level data as well as our weapon evolution data. So if you were to look at our project as it stands right now, coming off of part 14, we would also have had to create weapon evolution data. That is under scriptable object. So if we wanted a weapon evolution, for every weapon evolution, we would have to create a new blueprint like that. Okay, so that would be 18 files plus 1 weapon evolution blueprint, or multiple if your weapon can evolve into multiple forms. So this is clearly not ideal, and this is why we set out, or rather I set out to work on part 50. So we want all of our data to be in one single file. Okay, if you look at this little file here, let me just zoom in a little bit more. So we have the knife data, and then we have the evolution data in one array. We have the base stats. Base stats are, if you were to, let's say, search for knife weapon, for example, in Vampire Survivors. So every weapon has a set of stats, and then these are the base stats. So every weapon has the same set of stats right here. So we would have had base stats, and then we would have data to grow the weapon. So for example, level 2, how does it grow? Level 3, how does it grow? Etc. etc. And then we also have random growth. I'll explain this later. This is a little more complex, but the main idea of it is, instead of spreading our files over 16 different files in the project window, everything is being kept in one single file. So this will also apply to our passives, and then this will also apply to our weapon evolution system, which is stored inside the weapon or the passive data itself. And then this will later also apply to our character data. So because when we change the weapon data, we would have changed everything else. This is why this part is very long. So initially I set out just to create something like this for the weapons, and then I realized that for this to work, we also have to apply this system to the passives, and then we would also have to apply this system to weapon evolution, and then we will also have to partially apply this weapon system to the character files that we have. So after this part is going to be very illuminating for those of you who are following the series and learning how to code. This part is also going to make the entire project that we have a lot easier to use. So if you have had questions about how to create new weapons, you want to watch this part, or at least just download the project files for this part, because it's going to be a lot easier for you to create new weapons after part 50. So let's look at the introduction right here. So with the weapon system we've set up in previous parts, it's going to be, again, it's very hard to create weapons with the previous part, right? Because with the previous files that we have, because we need to create so many data files. So with the revamp, again, we want to get from having everything in multiple files to everything in one single file. So the introduction, I'll just leave you guys to read the article yourself. If by the time you're looking at this video, it's still free. Otherwise, I've explained everything in the past couple of minutes already, so you can just skip the introduction. Okay, let's go straight into creating the weapons script. Okay, so for us to go from having this system to this system over here, we have to create, obviously, a couple of new scripts. Okay, and the first script that we're going to create is the most important script of them all, because it allows us to manage the stats of our weapon. So let me just run through how this will work. So we're going to create a new struct called Weapon.Stats. Okay, and this is actually gonna go inside a new file called the weapon file. So I'm gonna head over back to the project right here, and I'm gonna go into the scripts folder, and then I'm gonna go to the weapons folder right here. I'll create a new script here. Obviously it's called weapon. And in this weapon file here, we are going to just gonna open it up. And I am going to copy the script from the article. So I'm just gonna copy this guy here, and I'll paste it in Visual Studio. I'll try this again. Copy this. Okay, that's not working. Let me just. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I've copied the script here. I'm missing a line of, just give me a moment, alright? Just modify the code in the blog because I found a small mistake in my code here. Let me just show you where the mistake is. Hi Arthur, Happy New Year. So I was just explaining why we were doing part 15, and today we'll be running through the entirety of part 15's contents. And I've just found an error in the code, so I'm just gonna hit it to the post and modify that. Fine. So if you look at the code that we have here, what we are missing is, you see there are some errors over here, red underlines here. This is because I forgot to add the namespace right here. So once I add a namespace, all the errors should be fixed because we are using Unity's library, so we just have to drop this in. So just allow me some time to update the article and just add this as well. Okay, next let me explain what's going on with the stats object here. So if you look at what we have here, we're creating a new abstract class called a weapon. Why is this abstract? Abstract classes, if something is abstract, it means that you will not be able to attach this script to a game object. So if I were to try and add a weapon, for example, I wouldn't be able to do that because the class is abstract. So the other thing we are creating inside the weapon class is this struct called stats. Okay, so what is this struct called stats? So this struct here basically allows us to declare variables that will contain all of these smaller variables inside. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm gonna create also another script called the WeaponData, and then I'm gonna use this struct, this WeaponData struct that I've just created. So we've just copied this weapon file here, right? And then inside here we have a struct called stats. So with that, let us grab the WeaponData script, and then we will create a separate script for it. So what I've done here is I just created this WeaponData file, and I'm gonna open this up as well, and then I'm just gonna paste the script here. Okay, so let me explain WeaponData together with the Weapon.Stats struct that we have. So WeaponData is basically a scriptable object, which means that once we copy the WeaponData file, which is right here, so once we copy that, what we will get is we will get in Unity editor, right? We will get, just give me a moment, we will get the ability to create a new WeaponData like that. So these are scriptable objects, and if we were to create this scriptable object, you would probably find this familiar because we would have to create this for the old weapon system as well. You will see that we have a couple of variables inside here, just 5 variables. We have a max level, we have an icon, which is the icon for the weapon. We have base stats, and then we have linear growth, which is an array of items that contain the same elements as the base stats over here. So this is what the WeaponStats struct is supposed to allow us to do, because if you look at the WeaponData script, we have WeaponStats right here. And just change over to the Visual Studio view. So we have the WeaponStats. We are using WeaponStats to create the base stats variable, the linear growth variable and the random growth variable. Of course, the last two are arrays, which means that of course you can add multiple items of weapon stats into the variable. So this weapon stat struct is defined inside weapon itself. So we have weapon and then we have stats. This is why the data type is Weapon.Stats. And this is supposed, of course, to express the stats that a weapon has. So by creating the struct in weapon over here, we will be able to have access to this variable type, which when we use it will allow us to get these drop downs like that. So let me just go a little bit deeper into how the weapon stats struct works. So the weapon stats struct, basically the weapon class now has nothing inside. There is just a separate stats inside, stats struct inside. You can think of a struct as like a class. So this is like a class that is inside a class. And here is the code for it. So what we have here is inside the stats struct or the stats class, we have a couple of variables. We have the name, we have the description, we have projectile prefab and aura prefab, which is the attached projectile and the attached aura for the weapon. We have commented this out currently because we will have to create the projectile script and the aura script later before this can work. So the other thing that I have over here, of course, is the hit effect, which when the weapon hits, what effect plays. And then we have something called spawn variance, which I will get into once we create the knife. And then there are some other variables here: lifespan, damage, damage variance, etc, etc. These are all the specific stats that the weapon has. If you go to the Vampire Survivors wiki, you will find that every weapon has a whole bunch of stats. So we are representing all of these stats inside the weapon stats variable right here. All these variables inside the struct. And the other key thing that we are defining inside the weapon script, or rather the Weapon.Stats script struct, is the plus operator. So what is this plus operator? What does it allow us to do? So what this plus operator allows us to do is it allows us to manage our stats a lot easier later on. What do I mean by that? Let me go back to the article. So the plus operator that we have right here is basically a definition of how the plus operator will work together with multiple stats objects. So for example, later when we create the level up system, the new level up system for the weapons, we will have to calculate every time the weapon levels up, we have to calculate the new stats for the weapon. The reason that we have adopted such a dynamic way of manipulating a weapon is because notice that later on we're going to have passives, and then these passives will also affect our weapon. So every weapon has stats that are dynamic, and then of course you have buffs as well. So for example, some characters in Vampire Survivors, you get, I think there is a character called Clarice that has, sorry if I pronounce the name wrong, she has a temporary area buff to all her weapons. So this means that you will have to modify the stats of the weapon based on the buffs that the character has, the passives the character has, as well as when the character levels up. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a variable called Weapon.Stats that you can very easily operate on using the plus sign. So for example, if I wanted to calculate the stats that the character has for level 3, what I would do is I will add the base stats together with the level up stats, say for level 2, and then the stats for level 3, and then maybe I'll add all the stats that the passives provide, plus all the stats that the power-ups provide. So by having a plus sign, this makes it so that I don't have to manually calculate the value of every stat that I have inside the weapon. I can just use the plus sign, and then the logic inside the operator function will handle the rest for me. So if we take a closer look at the plus operator function, what it does is that whenever you try and add two objects that are stats together using the plus sign, what this will do is this will try and combine the two stats value together. Okay, so what we have here, for example, we have the name, we have the description. This is just the name and description of the stat object itself, which contains the description that you have for, say, level 1, level 2, etc, etc. Okay, and then you have the hit effect, which if the second item has a hit effect, then it will override the hit effect of the first item. So the name, the description, and the hit effect are the same. When you have two stat objects, it will always use, let's say when I add two stat objects together. So for example, if I do S1 plus S2, and then I want it to be the current stat of the weapon. So what's going to happen here is that if I do this, I will get S2, I'll use the name in S2, I'll use the description in S2. I will also use the hit effect in S2. Later on, I'm going to show you what this means when I display this with respect to the weapon data object in the inspector. Okay, so these three lines I'll explain later. You will get a better idea of how this works later. The rest of the values over here are added together. Okay, sorry, the spawn variance is overridden also. It's overwritten also. The rest of the values are added together. Okay, so for example, the lifespan is always going to be the sum of S1 and S2, S1 and S2, etc, 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 etc. Okay, so why is the stats operator set up this way? I'm going to show you how we can set up a simple weapon using the new weapon data system. Okay, so now that we have this weapon data script, and it uses the weapon stats struct, right? What we're going to have is, okay, we have this weapon data script using the weapon class, the struct inside the weapon class. So this allows us to create new weapon data objects by going to create. I'm not sure if the UI shows up. Let me just do a full screen here so I can show this to you. So if I were to go to create and then do a weapon data here like that, this allows me to create new weapon data objects. So every time I want to create a new weapon, I will just go to create weapon data like that. Alright. So what do we have inside every individual weapon data? So let's say if I want to define the stats for the knife, what I'm going to do is, let's say the knife has 8 levels. I'm going to call this the knife, and then we will head into the Vampire Survivors wiki, and then we can find the stats for the knife. So in the knife itself, you have all these different stats here. You have the description of the knife as well. So let's say if I were to copy this, and if I were to drop this into, say, description here, okay? So this would be, base stats would be the stats for level 1 of the weapon. And then the hit effect, I'll leave it empty for now. Spawn variance, I'll leave it at 0 for now. And I'm just going to fill in the rest of the stats right here. Okay, so the lifespan of the knife, this is the amount of time that the knife will fly before it goes away. I'm just going to leave it at, let's say 3. Damage, I'll copy from the wiki, so 6.5. Damage variance would be, this one is not in the wiki, this is just the amount of the range that the knife will have. So for example, if I were to have damage of 6.5, a damage variance of 2, this will give the knife a damage range from 6.5 to 8.5. Area would be, if I'm not wrong, is 1. Speed is projectile speed, it's 1. Cooldown for the knife is 1 second as well. Projectile interval is beyond the first level, right? The knife shoots multiple copies of itself. So how long in between is there a delay before the knife fires multiple copies of itself? That is the projectile interval. So again, we can retrieve this from the wiki. This is 0.1, and the knockback is 0.5. The number it starts from 1, right? This is the number of knives that are spawned. Piercing is just 1. Max instances, this is how many copies of knife can exist in the game at once. This is 17. So for us to create the knife, we enter in the base stats, and then because we have 8 levels, we have to put multiple elements inside linear growth. So this would be level 2. Level 2 for the knife. And the description over here would be, let me just grab the description from the wiki itself. So it would be fires 1 more projectile. So what happens when I enter the stats for level 2 is that this level 2 name will replace the name of the knife, and then the description will replace the current description of the knife when I level up. This has to do because later on you notice that whenever we level up, we will get the upgrade name. So it will say knife, level 1 or knife, and then level 2 and so on. Alright. So then we also have to have a description. The description will actually go inside here. So by putting the different levels as we level up, we will get level 2 fires on one projectile, level 3, level 4, etc, etc. Whereas the first time we get the knife, it will say right here knife, and then it will put the description inside here. So same thing for the heat effect in the spawn variant. So when we go to level 2, the values for level 2 will override the values for level 1. Okay, for the rest of the values right here, so for level 2, right, what difference does it make to the knife? It just fires one more projectile, right? So for the stats for level 2, you will just have to put, for number, you just have to put 1 like that. Let me just push this up so you can see. So my face is not blocking the inspector. Maybe I can just move my face right here. So for level 2, it's just fires one more projectile, so everything will be 0 except for the number here, which is 1, because whatever that we put inside the linear growth array will be incremental, except for the name and the description and the spawn effect and heat effect. So level 3 is going to be the same thing. Level 3 is going to be fires one more projectile and then base damage up by 5. Fires one more projectile and then base damage up by 5. So one more projectile and then base damage up by 5. So you will repeat this cycle on and on until you fill up all 8 levels of the knife. So I'm not gonna do this because I already done this for the project files that we have in Patreon. So I'm gonna show you the full thing later on at the end of the stream. So linear growth will be a way for us to define how the weapon grows over different levels. So level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, and so on until level 8. So what is random growth? Okay, random growth is a way for us to define what would happen if we, let's say we have 8 levels, right? But then in the knife here, we only define the growth for 5. What's going to happen next is that we are going to define a random way the knife can grow. So for example, for the name and description, we can just leave it empty. And then for the values over here, let's say there are 2 ways a knife can grow, right? It can either increase in number, or it can increase in both the number and the damage. So random growth is a way for the system to find a way for the knife to continue growing even if you do not supply enough levels. So you can mostly just ignore the random growth over here and then just work on the linear growth. This is the most important one. So if you grow beyond level 5, for example, our knife is just going to randomly pick one of the elements inside here to determine how the knife can continue growing. Okay, otherwise it will always pick from the linear growth. So the random growth array over here is actually intended to work with a mechanic in Vampire Survivors which is called limit break. So when I was coding this system, I was also thinking about future mechanics. I wanted to make this system as flexible as possible. So limit break allows your weapon to continue growing beyond the max level. So if I were to have, let's say 8 levels of the knife, if I would have 8 levels of the knife, if I wanted it to have a limit break, we can in the future add a checkbox that says limit break, and then after the 8th level it will automatically just draw growth data from the random growth. So for now, how this system works is that if you do not have enough levels specified, it will just randomly pick one of these ways for the weapon to grow. So all of this is made possible because the base stats, the linear growth and the random growth, they all use the weapon's struct, which is right here. The stats struct of the weapon class to be able to generate these variables. Again, all of these values are defined inside and then how the stats are added together are defined inside the plus operator. So this stat struct is really the baseline of this entire new weapon system. So I'm just gonna flash the code on the screen for a while here, and then we can just do a quick recap. Okay, so this is the stats struct. Okay, it goes inside the weapon class, and then it's just a whole bunch of variables that we have. So these variables are just different aspects of the weapon. We have commented out projectile prefab, and we have also commented out aura prefab right here. And then the rest of we have some visual variables, we have some values over here, and then we have a stats operator that defines how the stats are added together. Okay, this allows us to use the stats like this, where we just grab two stat objects, and then we can just add them together into an existing stat object. So this again allows us to add stats together. So for example, we have base stats, we have level up stats, and then we just add the stats together, we get the final stats or the current stats of the character. So beyond that, we also have a get damage function. So this get damage function just generates a damage value for us. So for example, every time the knife hits, we can just call get damage on weapon data to get the damage range of the weapon. So for example, for level 1, this will be 6.5 to 8.5, right, as we define inside our editor. So if we were to head over here, and if you recall on base stat 6.5, a damage variance of 2, what this means is that you'll get a damage range from 6.5 to 8.5. Okay, 6.5, and then a random range, damage variance of 0 to 2. Random range just picks a random number between 0 to 2, and it adds it to the damage. So random range is this get damage here just helps us to get a random value for the damage. And that's what the weapons stats struct does. So this weapon stats struct again is used inside the weapon data script, which is all the way below right here. So this weapon data script has a couple of values inside, and then it's essentially just the leveling data of the weapon. Alright, we have the level 1 stats over here, and then we define the rest of the levels incrementally inside the linear growth array like this. So with the weapon script setup and then the weapon data setup also, okay, weapon data is a lot simpler. Okay, we just have a whole bunch of variables over here. We also have this behavior variable that I will talk about later. This is linked to our weapon behavior scripts. So for now, we just define an icon, we define a max level. We also have the base stats for the weapon as well as the stats of the weapon when it grows from level to level. And then if the weapon grows beyond the maximum level, we also have a set of stats for it. Okay, finally, we have this function inside weapon data called getLevelData. And then what this does is that this basically just allows you to, for example, if I want to get the stats of the weapon on level 3, I will just go to the weapon and I will just do a getLevelData on the weapon itself to get the level data of the weapon. We use this function later as we craft our weapon script. So if you look at the weapon script that we have right here, it's not crafted yet. Oh, sorry, I just closed the file. Let me just reopen that. So if you look at our weapon script over here, sorry, wrong script. If you look at our weapon script over here, there's no code inside, it's just struct. So if we were to take away this struct, there's nothing inside. Alright, so we're gonna build more code for the weapon class later, and then we'll use the getLevelData function inside weapon data. Okay, so I've just explained the weapon data class. So if you want to refer to the article to have a read of that, you can refer to the article as well. There's a list of all the properties inside the weapon data that you can read through to get a sense of what it does. Again, I've just explained them. As well as how it works as well. So I explained this earlier in the stream. Okay, so let's move on to creating the rest of the weapon class. Okay, so now that we have the weapon data script, which is where the weapons will draw data from, we will create a logic for the weapon script. Okay, so the green highlighted sections over here, these sections are the ones that are added into the weapon class. So I'm going to grab these green sections and put it into my weapon class. Okay, so what is this summary over here? This summary over here is just so that when you mouse over the class inside Unity, okay, I forget where it's supposed to appear. I think it's supposed to appear when I mouse over the, let me see. Okay, it's supposed to appear somewhere, but I don't recall where it's supposed to be appearing. But anyway, this is also just documentation explaining what this component is supposed to do. So we have a small description for the class. This is great for documentation so that you remember what you are coding. And the green highlights represent the added sections. So let me just add these sections and then we'll run through what these sections do. So we have the summary that's added. I think these are also added, which are they or are they not? Never mind, let's look at the rest of the code first. Okay, so we define a couple of variables over here. We have the current level, we have the max level as well. Okay, so what does the weapon script do? The weapon script is supposed to manage the current status of the weapon. So whenever we attach a weapon to the character, what's going to happen is the weapon class or some child of the weapon class is going to be attached to the character. And then the weapon will come together with a weapon data, which allows the weapon to read, for example, every time the weapon levels up, what are the stats it should have. So the weapon will manage what the weapon class will manage what the current level of the weapon is. What is the maximum level that the weapon can grow to? It's gonna save a copy of the owner of the weapon, because of course when the weapon deals damage, the character has a might stat, right? So the weapon will always have to read from the character's might stat to multiply the amount of damage that it does. Obviously the weapon also has a set of current stats. The current stats will store all the stats of the weapon from the base stats all the way to all the level up stats. And then of course all the power-ups and passives as well. So the current stats is a variable that basically adds all these different stats together to arrive at the stat that the weapon should have. The weapon also has a current cooldown which is protected, which means that it's not shown on the inspector. And then there is also a player movement script, which again is protected together with current stats and owner. They're all protected variables. Alright, so why are they protected? It's because they are not supposed to show up in the inspector, but they are accessible to child classes. So the weapon class has an initialize function. What the initialize function does is it just extracts data from the weapon data. So it extracts the max level of the weapon, it tries to find the player stats object of the player. It also tries to saves the entire data file into the data variable over here so that we can always check the data for the weapon to see how the weapon should level up. Okay, then we assign the current stats of the weapon to its base stats, and then we find the movement object which we will have to use to aim the weapon, for the knife at least, and then we assign the current cooldown to current stats dot cooldown. So the initialize function is just there to start up the weapon, okay, by assigning essential data to the weapons variables right here. So what happens later on is that when the weapon starts up, okay, we are going to assign the weapon's current stats as its base stats. Again, the data variable over here is the weapon data, so we're gonna extract the base stats of the weapon and assign it to our current stats variable. And then of course we initialize the weapon. So after initialization, what happens? The key logic inside the weapon class itself is actually the update class right here. So the update class basically just tracks the cooldown of the weapon, and then whenever the cooldown of the weapon reaches 0, it's gonna call the attack function. The attack function takes a parameter here, which is number of projectiles to fire, or the number of times the weapon fires every time the cooldown finishes. Okay, again, if you recall, weapons like the knife, weapons like the whip, they fire multiple copies of the attack at higher levels. So this number here is essential. Later when we design the attack function for the knife, you will see what I mean. Okay, and then we have can level up, which controls whether the weapon is currently able to level up. We can add more conditions in child classes. This is a virtual function, which means that we can override this function to change the way the weapon levels up. There is also a do level up function, which checks if the weapon is able to level up. If it is not able to level up, it's gonna leave a warning. Otherwise, it's just gonna... What happens when you level up a weapon? You grab the current stats and then you add it to the... you add the data of the next level to the current level. So this plus current level here basically means that you take the level value, you increase it by 1. So if my current level is 1 and I do plus current level, this will change it to 2. Okay, so I'm gonna get the level 2 data, add it to the level 1 data, and then this will update the current stats when I level up the weapon. Okay, and finally we have a can attack function, which helps us to control whether the function is able to attack. If you go all the way back up to the attack function of the... that's all the way down actually. Okay, so if you go all the way down to the attack function of the weapon, you will see that there is a attack function. Okay, again, this is virtual so that you can override it. It checks for can attack. If the weapon can attack, it's gonna update the current cooldown and then return true, otherwise it's gonna return false. Okay, so this attack function doesn't do anything, and this is because you recall our weapon function, our weapon class is abstract, which means that we will have to subclass the weapon class later on if we want to use the weapon class. So because the weapon class doesn't do anything as of now, the attack function also doesn't do anything. It just helps us to refresh the cooldown. Okay, finally we have get damage on the weapon. This extracts the damage from the current stats of the weapon, and then it multiplies it by the might of the character. Okay, so this factors in the stats of the character to deal damage. And finally we have get stats, which just allows us to get the current stats of the character. Nothing much right here. So what we have in the weapon class is this is a blueprint for us to create logic for further weapons in the future. That's what the weapon class is supposed to help us do. So I'm just gonna grab this entire chunk of code here and I will drop it into my weapon class. So this entire chunk of green goes into Visual Studio, to the weapon class. We have, okay, so when you add in your script, just pay attention to not add it into the stats struct. Okay, it should always be outside of the stats struct, which means that it's just right before the final curly bracket over here. So if you copy and paste it right, your code shouldn't have any errors with the copy and paste process. So when you copy and paste the code, I recommend you read through the code yourself as well and try and understand as much of it as possible. So I'll be going through the logic, but you will have to process the code yourself to be able to get a sensing of what's happening. So the key takeaway over here is you can get a sensing of what I'm doing. This will help you when you try and design your own weapons or your own infrastructure for your different genres of games in the future. Okay, so there are some mistakes in the code that I have in the blog, so let me just update the code for a little bit. Yeah, I already have the file open. So firstly, in the weapon script over here, we don't need these two lines, and I've also mistakenly highlighted the last line, the last curly bracket. The last curly bracket is not supposed to be highlighted. So just give me a moment to edit this, and we will get back to going through the code afterwards. Okay, so let's continue this. So once you've copied and pasted your code, I recommend that you also just check Unity editor to make sure that no errors are appearing. So if you've copied and pasted everything correctly, the code should compile and there shouldn't be any errors arising from you adding the weapon as well as the WeaponData script, which is right here. Okay, for the knife that you've created, you can choose to keep it or you can choose to delete it. If you choose to keep it later on, we're gonna have to move this to a different folder just to keep everything organized. Okay, so the new files for now are weapon and WeaponData. So now that we've created a weapon class and I've explained what the weapon class is supposed to do. Okay, so over here, let's just go through the list just to make sure that I don't miss out anything. So what does the weapon class do? Okay, it helps us to keep track of the core functionalities of the weapon, which is basically two roles. The weapon class helps us to handle the leveling up of the weapon. Recall that whenever we level up the weapon, we have to update the current stats. And then we have to update the current stats by drawing the current stats from the weapon data. Okay, then we also have to, of course, the weapon manages whether we can level up, and then if the weapon can level up, we will do the level up, which updates the stats. So the other thing the weapon class does is that it automatically handles the cooling down and triggering of the weapon's attack. So if you look at the update function under weapon, okay, whenever the update function runs every frame, it's gonna count down the current cooldown. Then once the current cooldown goes below 0, it's gonna fire attack. Then what attack is gonna do is attack is going to refresh the cooldown. Right? So this creates a cycle because in Unity, in Vampire Survivors, the weapon fires itself every time the cooldown finishes, right? So it handles the leveling up, the weapon script handles the leveling up. The weapon script also handles the attacking. And there is also a note here that explains why everything in the weapon, most of the functions in weapon class is marked virtual. Again, this is because the weapon class is abstract, which means that later on we're going to create more scripts that inherit from the weapon class. And then when we want to do inheritance in our code, we will have to override some of our functions. Okay, we will get more into that later when we create a knife weapon, where we will have to override the weapon class right here. Okay, so let's get started by creating the knife weapon. We are halfway through creating the weapon for ourselves, right? Okay, so what is the knife weapon going to entail? Okay, so the first thing we're gonna create is a script that is called WeaponEffect. What is WeaponEffect? So when we work with Vampire Survivors, right, our weapon has a couple of parts. Okay, one part of the weapon is basically the logic for the weapon, handling the cooldown, when the projectile fires and everything. Okay, that used to be the weapon controller. So if you were following when Xavier was working on the series, okay, he had a weapon controller, and then he also had weapon behaviors. Weapon controllers are basically responsible for controlling when the weapon fires, and then weapon behavior is, it just fires the projectile of the weapon. So in the case of the knife controller controls the cooldown, the knife behavior controls the projectile of the knife. Okay, so we are going to create a new weapon effect script that is going to serve as the parent class for all our weapon behaviors. So for example, you will have, we're going to create some generic weapon behaviors that we can apply to multiple scenarios. Okay, the two weapon effects that we are going to be having so far is an aura as well as the projectile. Okay, so if you scroll up higher in the article, okay, you will find that for the projectile we are able to define, sorry, not the projectile, for every weapon that we have, you can define a projectile and you can define the aura. Both the projectile and the aura are weapon effects. So the aura is used for the garlic. It can also be used for other scenarios, like for example the pentagram can use an aura as well. And then if you remember, there is a center water. Center water throws a projectile that spawns an aura. So basically this aura weapon effect that we have, we can apply it to multiple weapons later. Same for the projectile. So we have many weapons which fire projectiles, right? We have the axe, we have the knife, we have the peach one, and we have the darker peach one, right? Okay, we have a whole bunch of weapons that fires projectiles and a whole bunch of weapons that spawn auras. So we want to create these as weapon effects that we can continuously reuse when we create these other weapons as well, which is why we are creating a more generic set of scripts for them. So let's go all the way back down to our weapon effect script. Which is, okay, where are we? Okay, which is right here. So I'm just gonna copy the weapon effect script. We will have to put this into. Okay, so what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to reorganize our codes a little bit. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of scripts here from the old system. And here's what I'm gonna do. I will be creating a new folder called obsolete. And then I will be moving all of these old scripts inside the obsolete folder. This helps us to organize our code base a little bit so that we know what scripts we are dealing with. Okay, so one thing that you can do also for these obsolete scripts is that you can just open them up. And then right above the class definition of the script, you can just add a system.obsolete. And this will be replaced by the weapon data, something like that. So if you were to add an obsolete marker into the weapon itself, if you want to head back into the project, every time you use the script, so over here we use the weapon scriptable object, right? So if we use the weapon scriptable object, then you will see that now all the weapon scriptable objects will have an obsolete notice over here. Alright, this is because we've added a system.obsolete that's right above the class. Okay, so this is just for us to mark scripts as being not used anymore. Okay, so why don't we just delete these scripts? Because if we have an existing system and we delete the scripts inside our project, we may just break code, and then this will allow us to not be able to run the program. This is why we want to just mark a script as obsolete first, and then later on when we have more time, or later on when we completely shift over to the new weapon system, then we can go about and start removing the scripts that we have marked obsolete. So what you want to do is you want to just find all of these scripts that you have refiled into the obsolete folder, and then just do yourself a favor and then mark them as obsolete one by one. Right? So I've just done it for one script. In the project files that we're going to be sharing, we've also marked all the other scripts as obsolete as well. Okay, but without further ado, because I only have 4 hours, I'm just gonna move on with whatever that we have been talking about so far. Okay, so we were copying the weapon effect script, right? So now that we have reorganized our weapons folder, I will create a new folder called weapon effects under the scripts folder. So this new folder is called weapon effects. And inside weapon effects over here, let me just move my face right back to the bottom right corner. Under weapon effects here, this new folder, I can create the new weapon effect script. So as I was saying, this new weapon effect script is going to be the parent class for all our different weapon effects. So what we have inside here is, this is just okay, what is inside the summary? This is a game object that is spawned whenever a weapon fires. So projectiles, auras. Later on, we're gonna create these things called pulses as well. So different weapons spawn different weapon effects. All right. So in the weapon effect, it's just gonna store a couple of things. It's just gonna store the damage. It's just gonna store a way for us to get the weapon damage. Okay, so whenever a weapon fires and the weapon effect hits something, the damage of the weapon effect comes from the weapon itself, and then the weapon collects damage from the weapon data. So notice that we have created a downstream of information. It starts from weapon data. Sorry, it starts from weapon, get damage, and then this get damage here retrieves the damage from the struct, which is the stats right here. So get damage starts here, it flows down to the weapon, and then the weapon effect will retrieve the damage from the weapon itself as well. Okay, so the weapon effect just stores a copy of the player stats, which is who owns the weapon, as well as the weapon itself. And because the weapon effect is not meant to be edited inside the inspector, the class is marked as abstract. And then of course we have a hide inspector to remove the variables from showing up in the inspector when we use the weapon effect. So again, this is an abstract class, which means that we are not going to be using this component directly. Okay, so let me just save this, and then we will move on to the next piece of script that we are going to be copying. So the next piece of script is going to be the projectile script. So the projectile script defines the behavior for projectiles for all our weapons. So the first projectile we're going to be creating is the knife projectile, but later on we're going to have other kinds of projectiles as well. We have the axe, we have the fire one, and then all these projectiles will perform, or rather they will execute themselves differently. The knife will always fly straight forward, the axe will fly up and then fall down, and then we have also the fire one, which will home in onto an enemy, right? Okay, so what we're going to be doing is this projectile script is going to be kind of like an all-purpose script that we can modify accordingly to modify the behavior of our projectiles. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Okay, so after we copy and paste the projectile script, we will be able to use the projectile to set up a prefab for the knife. So let's say for the knife. Okay, so the projectile component will have 3 different variables that you can choose from. You have damage source, you have auto aim, and then you also have rotation speed. Alright, so what the damage source variable does is that this controls how the knockback is calculated for the enemy when the projectile hits. Okay, so if you look at our coding streams, right, we created a couple of weapons, and then one of the weapons that we've created was the whip. Okay, let me see if we can find a copy of the whip that we've created for those of you who are just watching this part for the first time and you haven't been following our streams. So if you head over to community over here and scroll and scroll and scroll, somewhere down there we have a screenshot of the whip and the soul eater that we have created as well. This picture of my beautiful face. Where is the whip? There we go. So if you look at the projectile for the whip, one of the problems that we have is that the whip, okay, you notice that when the whip fires, right, whip actually pushes the one of the bats closer to us, which means that the knockback is not working properly, right? Okay, so for knockback to work properly for some projectiles, we will have to determine where the damage source of the projectile is coming from. Okay, so if we were to look at this picture over here, when the knife hits the bat over here, okay, the knockback is gonna be pushing the bat in this direction, and this is because the difference in positions of the knife and the bat gives us a knockback like that. Okay, so whereas if we have the damage source as owner, when the knife hits the bat, what's gonna happen is that it's gonna be pushed in this direction, and this is because the knockback is calculated from the owner if you choose owner as damage source. So we have two options for how the projectile performs knockback, based on the projectile itself or based on the owner. And this has to do with how different weapons work. So for example, if we were to use the whip as an example, right, the whip right now is using the projectile itself as the source of the knockback. So if, I'm just trying to capture a screenshot of the whip firing. Okay, let me try again, and I can use paint to draw this out for you. Okay, let me just see if I can do this in paint. Okay, so if we were to have the knockback, so the whip, when it fires, it's just gonna be something like this, right? Okay, so what's gonna be happening is that the whip is gonna have its damage source. Sorry, the position is gonna be right here. Okay, so if the whip fires, and let's say we have a bat that is right here, okay, the bat and the whip is gonna be causing the knockback of the whip to be going in this direction, okay, which is towards the player character itself. This is obviously not ideal because and this is happening because the damage source of the whip projectile is being calculated from the whip itself. Okay, so the center of the whip is actually away from the player enough that if something else is between the center of the whip and then the character, the enemy is going to be pushed towards us. This is not ideal because the enemy, when it touches us, is going to do damage to us. So for the whip, we will not be using the center of the projectile as a damage source. Instead, for the whip, the damage source will always be on the player, so that even if the bat is over here, it will always be pushed back. This is why the projectile has a damage source attribute, so that for different kinds of projectiles, for projectiles that are close range, we are able to set it so that no matter where the projectile touches, it will always push the enemy back away from the player. Okay, we don't want our projectiles, if it hits too close, let's say for the whip, for it to push enemies towards us, because that would be counterproductive to the weapon, right? It actually harms us. Okay, so this is the first property for the projectile. Second one is has auto aim. It has auto aim, basically allows us to control whether the projectile fires in a certain direction. So for example, for the knife wouldn't have auto aim, because if the knife had auto aim, it's gonna be always flying towards an enemy that it chooses. Okay, so the knife has no auto aim, but something like the fire one, for example, will have auto aim. Why? Because the fire one always will find the closest enemy, not the closest, finds one random enemy and the projectile goes towards it, right? Okay, so the fire one would be an example of a weapon that has auto aim, whereas the knife would be an example of a weapon that does not have auto aim. And finally, we have rotation speed as well. Rotation speed just allows us to make our projectile rotate over time. Yeah, so like for example, the axe has a rotation speed, which means that it flows around the air before it falls back down to the bottom of the map, or whatever you call it. Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna copy the projectile script over here, and then we're gonna use it to set up the knife. Okay, and I'm also gonna briefly explain the code inside the projectile script as well. So I've created a new projectile script here, and then let's go into the Visual Studio and just gonna copy and paste the script. Again, you are encouraged to read through the script yourself and try and get an understanding of it. Okay, so it's not enough if you really want to get a hang of how all this stuff works. It's not enough just to listen to me explain. Take some time, pause the video, read through the script on your own time. Try and make sense of it. And one thing I like to do when I'm reading other people's script is I like to write my own comments in the scripts. So as I read through the script that someone else has written, I'm going to be writing comments to try and figure out what the hell the guy is trying to do for each chunk of code. Okay, so writing the comments helps me to understand an existing piece of script. So for the projectile script right here, okay, we have all the different variables defined. So this damage source here, we first declare an enum of projectile and owner. What this does is this allows us to select. Later on, this is a drop down that gives us two options, projectile and owner, which I've just explained a couple of minutes ago. Okay, has auto aim, same thing, I've explained this. Rotation speed, I've also explained this. Okay, one thing you want to notice is the projectile has a require component right here. Okay, so the projectile on top uses Unity engine, and then there is a require component right here. And then after that, there is a it's the class definition. Okay, one thing to note is it inherits from WeaponEffect, very important. Okay, and then you have all these variables right here. You have rigid body, so the projectile will be using a rigid body to move around. This is because the projectile will need to detect collisions with other objects, and then if you don't have a rigid body attached, you will not be able to detect collisions. Okay, this piercing attribute basically controls how many times the projectile will be able to go through enemies. So if I have a piercing value of 5, the projectile will be able to hit 5 enemies before it goes away. Piercing is also defined inside WeaponData, which is right here. One of the values, under weapon, one of the values for the stats of the weapon is piercing. So this piercing attribute will be transferred to the projectile, and then the projectile will be able to know how many times it is able to go through enemies. So when the projectile starts, what it does is it tries to retrieve the stats of the weapon that it belongs to, so that of course it can know how much damage to deal. It can also know the piercing, how many targets it can pierce through. Okay, obviously we are going to retrieve the rigid body as well, because the projectile will be using the rigid body to move around. Okay, and then over here we have two types of behaviors for the projectile, depending on whether the projectile is a kinematic or the projectile is a regular rigid body. Let me just refer you to an article if you want to get a sense of what a kinematic and what a regular rigid body is. So if you go into a rigid body over here, you will see that there are 3 options that you can choose from. Let me just share the full screen so that you can see the drop down here. Okay, so there are 3 options here: dynamic, kinematic, and static. So you really only have 2 options, because static means that the rigid body cannot move. So whenever you want to control a rigid body, there are two options that you have: dynamic and then kinematic. Dynamic will react to forces, which means that if I were to push an object that is dynamic, it's going to move away, whereas something that is kinematic will always move in the same direction. We actually have an article. We will eventually link this in the description of the video below. But we have an article that covers this very well. Let me just search for the article. Okay, there is an article that we have done called "What is a Kinematic Rigid Body," which is very helpful. Okay, I wrote this. Okay, so what is a kinematic rigid body versus a regular rigid body? Okay, there is a perfect example over here that shows this. Okay, so over here we have a dynamic rigid body. Okay, notice the arrow gets affected. Whereas if it's a kinematic, it's just gonna plow right through. Okay, so what this means is that when you create your projectiles in the Vampire Survivors series, you have two options. Okay, if you were to set the rigid body of the projectile as dynamic, it means that you maybe want the projectile to bounce around, or whereas let's say you have something like a knife, okay, you would prefer to use it as a kinematic. Alright, so whether you want it to be dynamic or rigid or kinematic is up to you. The projectile script handles both behaviors. Okay, so if the rigid body is dynamic, it's going to apply a force to the rigid body. If the rigid body is kinematic, then it will have to be driven by code. Okay, so if you look at the article, let's go back to the article again. One of the differences between a kinematic and a dynamic rigid body is that kinematic rigid bodies, they are driven by code. So you cannot just set a velocity for the rigid body and expect it to move. You have to move it frame by frame. Okay, whereas for a regular rigid body, if you just apply a velocity to it, you can let the Unity physics engine handle the rest. Okay, so if the rigid body is dynamic, which means that it's not a kinematic, we are just going to apply a velocity and then let Unity handle the movement of the projectile for us. Okay, whereas if it's a kinematic, we are gonna have to drive the movement ourselves. Right here, we're gonna have to drive the movement ourselves and move the projectile for ourselves every frame. Okay, so after this is done, it will calculate using the stats of the projectile. It will also expand the projectile based on what the area stat of the projectile is. So as notice that in Vampire Survivors, for some weapons, right, as the level of the weapon grows, the weapon becomes bigger and bigger. So this is because the area increases, and then when area increases, we will just increase the scale of our projectile. Okay, so this makes everything a lot easier to handle. We save the piercing stat, and then we set the projectile to destroy itself after a certain amount of time. And then we also do this thing where if the projectile has auto aim, we will call this function called acquire auto aim facing. And what this does is that basically what auto aim does is it just finds all the enemies on screen, and then it picks a random enemy, and then it points the projectile towards the enemy. That's all it does. Okay, so it will automatically find a suitable target to move towards. That's for acquire auto aim facing. And then in fixed update, it will drive the projectile manually. We will move the projectile ourselves using transform.position if and only if the projectile is a rigid body that is kinematic. And finally, we have on trigger enter 2D, which will detect two kinds of enemies. So whenever an enemy touches the projectile, or whenever something that is breakable touches the projectile, we will do something to it. So if an enemy touches it, we will deal damage to the enemy, and then we will of course give it the source so that it can apply knockback. Knockback is covered in part 13 of our tutorial series, so you can go and have a look at the video. And then it will get the stats of the weapon. Why do we get the stats of the weapon here? I don't think we need the stats anymore actually. Oh, sorry, we need the stats because we need to retrieve the hit effect. So we deal damage, reduce number of piercing, the piercing value so that it can go through one less enemy. And then over here, if stats hit effect. So if we have a hit effect assigned, we will play the hit effect. Okay, so it will spawn the hit effect and we'll destroy it after 5 seconds. And then if it's a breakable object, we will just, or if it's a prop, we'll just deal damage. Again, we'll reduce the piercing, and then we will play the hit effect as well. And finally, after we finish running through all this logic, if the piercing value of the projectile is less than 0, we will remove the projectile from the game. So again, what does the projectile script do? It's basically an all-in-one script. that we use, or that we are going to be using as a base for all of our projectile prefabs. Hello Dad, thanks for the well wishes. Happy New Year to you too. So now that we have the projectile script, for us to get the knife weapon working, we will have to create a prefab for the knife, and then we will have to attach the projectile script to it. Okay, so again, this is a little bit similar to the old system, in the sense that again we have a weapon controller, which is replaced by the weapon class, and then we also have a weapon behavior, which controls the thing that the weapon spawns. Okay, but in the old system, for every weapon that you create, you will have to create one new behavior script for the weapon. Whereas with the new system, we have generic classes. So for example, the projectile class we will be able to use for every projectile inside our game. So this will reduce the number of scripts that we have and help to make the process of creating these weapons a lot more intuitive, there's a lot less moving parts to it, a lot less files you have to create. Okay, so hopefully this helps to make the... Okay, I shouldn't say hopefully, because I'm very sure that this will help to make the entire system a lot more easy to use. Okay, so for the knife projectile, once we have the projectile script, we can head to the prefabs folder, and then we can head to... where did I save it? Let me just check. So we have to create the prefab for the knife. Let me just double check where it saved the prefab in the original coding stream. Okay, I think I saved it inside weapons. Okay, I'm just gonna put it inside assets, prefabs, weapons for now. So we will create a new knife. Let me find a copy of the knife here. Our knife is this guy, right? So let's drop it onto the scene. So we create a new knife, should be foreground, right? Then this knife here, you will want it to be, let's call it a knife. Projectile. I'm gonna attach this weapon to the knife projectile here, and then we're gonna set the form back to 0, and let's point this knife to the right. Then we can prefab this whole thing. So for the knife projectile here, make sure it's pointing to the right. This is very important because this has to do with the rotation of the projectile. I'm gonna prefab the knife projectile, and we're gonna add a projectile script. So what this does is that because our projectile script over here, because we have a required component rigid body 2D, this means that whenever you add a projectile script, this will automatically add a rigid body 2D right here. So for the knife, it's always going to be flying on a set path. So then we just set it to kinematic. And then we auto aim is, there's no auto aim, the knife doesn't rotate also. So this will be unchecked, and then 0, 0, and 0 here. So the last thing we will need for the knife is we will need to add a box collider. And we can just adjust the collider. This is the hitbox of the knife. And we can just put it to be at the blade area like that. And that's all we need. We have set up knife projectile. So make sure that you just save the prefab by going to overrides and apply all, so that this prefab here is updated. So we'll be coming back to using this knife projectile later once we create a knife projectile weapon. So Deb has a great question. So he asks, or she asks, I'm sorry if I get a gender wrong. So Deb asks if copy paste is good for beginners. Well, ideally you want to write your own scripts, but I find that the best way to learn coding isn't actually to write your own script or to copy and paste. It's to mod an existing code base. So for example, now what we are doing is you're looking at me and looking at the article, and then we are setting up a new system, right? So with this new system that we've set up, you will, let's say you want to create your own weapons, you will have to write scripts that are based on my scripts. So this is, in a way, this is called modding, and this is how I learn my coding. So with modding, I think you learn the fastest because you're able to expose yourself to really advanced scripts. At the same time, the scripts that you write will be simpler because the hard codes have already been written, and then you are just left with understanding what is being written and then trying to expand upon those things. So in this sense here, I think modding is a very happy medium. At least for me it was. I had a lot of fun modding because you see results so fast. If you were to code a system, you would spend a lot of time, like I spent 6 coding streams worth of time. Just whatever I'm explaining to you here in the last 1.5 hours, right? For me to figure it out, it took me many hours, like a couple of days of work. So when you're modding, you don't have to go through all of that, you know, to go through code and then not see any results. With modding, because you're building upon someone else's code, you can, for example, you want to create say a new projectile weapon. You follow the steps for the knife, but then just change certain things. You can create your own weapon, so you see the results very fast, so you stay encouraged. At the same time, it's not a walk in the park because, you know, you're working in code that has already been written. So you see results fast, but you get to work with advanced code as well. So this helps you to learn really fast, which is why I love to use modding as a way to learn so much. So what you want to do is, once you go through this tutorial, maybe now that you know how to create a knife, and then you can create something else. Yeah, try to base it off the scripts that we have, create a new weapon, and then see how that works out. So that will be great for learning. Great question. Thanks for the question there. Okay, so where were we? We just created a knife projectile, right? Okay, and the next thing we will be covering is, okay, we have to go all the way back to the Weapon.Stats struct, and then we have to enable the projectile prefab. So previously, when we copied the script from weapon, this was commented out, and the reason is because we haven't set up the projectile script. So now that we've set it up, we can head all the way back to weapon script and then just uncomment this. This will allow us to assign a projectile prefab to our weapon, which means that we can, if we were to go back to our scriptable object for the knife, where is it? Knife, okay, I have it here, but you should really put it inside your scriptable object folder. Okay, this is my knife weapon. So then now, because we enabled the projectile prefab here, you are able to assign the prefab. Just gonna lock this here, and then I can head over to the prefabs folder and then find the knife projectile and just drop it inside here. Okay, so for the subsequent levels, I will not have to modify the knife projectile because it will always use the base stats projectile. Only if I want to, let's say, have a different projectile for level 2, I will create a different prefab and then assign it over here. Okay, so if you use the same projectile throughout, you can just use the same knife projectile. So usually you only change this if you want to change, let's say you want the knife to become red color for level 2, you want a knife to become gold color for level 3, then you will create different projectiles for different levels. Otherwise, just use the same one. Okay, it saves on the amount of prefabs that you have to manage for one single weapon. Okay, so the next thing that we have to do, now that we have gotten the knife projectile to work, is that we will need to code. We will need to expand upon the weapon class to create this thing called the projectile weapon script. So the projectile weapon script is going to be pretty Okay, I wouldn't say it's shorter than the weapon script, but because it expands upon the weapon class, we do not have to code as many things as compared to the weapon class. So the projectile weapon is there because firstly, it's meant to serve as a skeleton for all the projectile weapons in the game. So right now we're gonna write this script for the knife itself, but later on you will be able to modify this just a little bit so that you can apply this to the axe and to, let's say, the magic wand, etc, etc. Okay, the main thing the projectile weapon has to fire is this. Sorry, the main thing the projectile weapon has to handle is this. Okay, I have a little sprite here of little animated GIF here of multiple projectiles. So the projectile weapon's main role is to basically handle the firing of multiple knives. Okay, and how is it done? Alright, so let's look at the projectile weapon script together. Okay, so the projectile weapon script inherits from weapon. Okay, that is quite obvious in itself. And there are two variables that it handles: current attack interval and current attack count. Okay, what is current attack interval? That is the time between two projectiles. Okay, if you look at the knife that we have in Vampire Survivors, it takes, what is the stat again for the knife? The knives don't come up instantaneously, right? Because if they did, they would all be in the same position. So every time the knife comes up, there is a short wait before the other knife comes up. So the interval is 0.1 seconds. Okay, so between two knives, there's 1/10 of a second. Okay, so this is the attack interval. Okay, and then there is the current attack count, which is the number of times that this attack will happen. So under the update function, we override the update function from the weapon class, and we call the weapon class's update function. What does it do? This will provide us with the attacking, right, whenever the weapon cools down. So we want the projectile weapon to be able to fire in two scenarios. The first scenario, whenever the knife cools down or the weapon cools down, and the second scenario when the weapon is currently firing, which means that there is an interval that is set. So in the second condition that the weapon is able to fire, okay, we have current attack interval greater than 0 right here. Okay, which if it's greater than 0, what we will do is we will try and reduce the current attack interval, and when we reduce it, if it goes below 0, it will also fire an attack. So there are two ways the weapon can fire: when it's on cooldown and when it's in the middle of attacking. And then so under the can attack function over here, we add an additional condition so that the weapon will be firing an attack. Sorry, what am I saying? We add an additional condition here so that if the weapon has more than one attack that is currently firing, it will always be able to attack. So if you recall in the original weapon script, let's go back to the weapon script over here. We have a can attack function right here that only allows the weapon to fire whenever the cooldown on the weapon is less than 0. Okay, so we add an additional condition in here, and then in this condition in here, what we do is we allow the weapon to attack if there is more than one attack that is currently being fired by the weapon. Okay, and then under the attack function over here, what it does is it does a few things. Okay, so the first chunk here that it does is it tries to make the code a little bit more idiot proof, in the sense that if you forget to assign a projectile prefab, then there will be a message. So when you look at my code for this part here, you will find a lot of debug log or debug warning or debug log errors, and these are basically just a way for us to document, to notify the user whenever there is an issue. So if you're using the script wrong, I love to leave warnings on the console to notify the user about what is wrong with their code. Okay, and if no projectile is fired, we will just reset the cooldown of the weapon, and then we will just leave a message. Okay, you don't have to reset the cooldown of the weapon, this is optional. Okay, but then after that, we also return false. Okay, so the return false here doesn't really do anything because we don't use the attack function to check for anything. But one thing that we can do if we return a boolean with our attack is that we are able to check whether the attack has succeeded or failed whenever we call the attack function. This may be useful in the future, but for now this is just something that I left there because it's just for the future in case we want to check whether an attack is successful or an attack fails. Right now we don't have to check it, so the boolean actually does nothing. The return value actually does nothing. So if there is a projectile prefab assigned, then our code is able to get here. And then in this part of the code, we check whether we're able to attack. If we cannot attack, again we return false. Okay, and then the important part, the meat of this function over here is the get spawn angle function, and then of course the instantiate function over here, which spawns a copy of the projectile. So before we spawn a copy of the projectile, what we do is we will get the spawn angle of the projectile. So the spawn angle is something that when we create the other weapons like the X or like the Fire 1 or whatever, right? The spawn angle allows us to determine where the projectile is facing. And where the projectile is facing is important because in the projectile script, we have made it so that the projectile will always move towards the right hand side, right here. Okay, if you head over to projectile and then you go to the start function here, we are always setting the projectile to move towards the right side of the projectile. So what this means is that if you go to Unity, and if we have a projectile right here, okay, you will see that if I rotate the projectile, let's say 30 degrees, you see the red arrow here changes. So transform.right is always going to be following this red arrow over here. Okay, so wherever our projectile is facing will be where the projectile flies towards. So what this means is that when we instantiate the projectile, let's go back to the code over here. Okay, so when we spawn the projectile, we will get the spawn angle, and then we will spawn the projectile and make it face the spawn angle. Okay, so there are a couple of questions on chat. There is a question on chat about Quaternion. I'll get to it later on. Okay, I'll explain Quaternions in a little bit more detail. So after we do that, we will go to the prefab, and then notice that the projectile script actually has a the weapon effect script has an owner as well as a weapon. So the weapon is a reference to the weapon that owns this effect, and then the owner is the player character that spawned this effect. And remember that projectile is a weapon effect, which means that the projectile will also have a weapon and an owner. Okay, the projectile over here has a weapon effect. Okay, so what this means is that when I create the projectile, what I want to do is I want to assign the weapon of the projectile to be this, because we are inside the projectile weapon script, right? So what we are doing is we're telling the prefab that the projectile weapon is its weapon that owns the projectile, and then this is the owner that spawned the projectile. Okay, this is because the projectile uses the weapon to determine the damage it should deal, because the stats are stored inside the weapon, and then the owner is used to calculate the knockback. We reset the current cooldown. Okay, there's a little error over here. Let me just modify this error. This shouldn't be data.basestats.cooldown. Where will be this? We will add the projectile script, right? So this should be okay. It's just a small error. Let me just correct this. So this should be current stats.cooldown. And then this should also be current stats.cooldown. Okay, this is the wrong script as well. Where is my weapon script? Ah, okay, so this should be, it shouldn't be the base stats, it should be the actual stats. Oh, sorry, this should be current stats. I'm sorry, not actual stats. Actual stats is from a different script. So which means I will have to update the script here as well. Oh, I haven't copied the projectile weapon. Get to that later then. So this should be current stats. So this refreshes the cooldown, and then it reduces the number of attacks that we have to fire. So when the attack fires, right? Whenever an attack fires, we will go ahead and also trigger the next attack. So let's say if we have 3 knives that are being fired, the first knife will trigger the second knife will trigger the third knife. So if the attack count is more than 0, we will have to trigger the next attack by setting the attack count to be equals to the current attack count, which is current attack count is whatever that we are recording here. So we will update the current attack count, and then we will update the current attack interval. This is if we still have more than one attack that is running. And then after that, we end the function by returning true, because if we have gotten to this part of the code and we have spawned the prefab, the attack is successful. Okay, so as for the get spawn angle, right, this is a function that we have created so that later on, if we want to create other weapons like the axe, we can just modify the spawn angle to change the trajectory of the weapon that we have. So for the knife itself, right, the weapon is going to be calculated from where the player character is moving. So if you recall in the player movement script, we record the last move direction of the player. So then to get the angle of that, we just gotta get the y and the x value of where the player is moving towards, and then we just gotta do an arctangent to get the angle and radians, and then after that we will have to convert these to degrees. And finally, get spawn offset. This function over here is, if you recall in part 13, right? In part 13, we have, okay, sorry, it's not part 13. Okay, it's under the coding, under the highlights for coding 4. Okay, you have to try and find a video on the channel. Let's explain. So basically, we have a get spawn offset, which is, okay, let me see where this thing is. Yeah, so the spawn variance right here. What this does is that this will create a little box around the player, and then this box over here is where the knives can spawn. So the bigger the spawn variance, the bigger the variance of the knife's position. So there's this little diagram over here that shows you how when you change the different values, this will change where the position of the box is. And then of course this will change how the area of the knife, this will change the area of the spawn variance. And then you can also, and because the character is able to move around, right, diagonally, we will use this little Quaternion over here to rotate the box as well. Okay, so you have to watch this video because the whole explanation is about 2 minutes. Okay, so you can just find this video and you can watch it to get a sense of the math. Okay, so there are a couple of questions from that. First question that we have is which book is good for beginners? I didn't learn programming reading any books. I just started modding stuff. That was how I learned my programming. So I started by modding. If you've I'm sure you guys know what is Dota, right? So I used to mod for Dota when Dota was in Warcraft 3. So I didn't learn how to code. I just started to create stuff in code, and then that was how I learned most of my stuff. Because if you were to read a book and learn coding, it's a really boring way to do it, and you will anyway have to try and do things yourself to really understand coding, which is why I encourage modding. So I would say don't read any books. Just download our Patreon files or get a copy of our files some way or other, and then from there you just try and create things off the codes that we have. This will be the fastest way to learn programming. Alright, so can I explain the use of Quaternions? Quaternions are pretty... Okay, let me try and explain this using pig. Okay, so what are Quaternions? Quaternions are rotations. Okay, so if you were to look at any game that we have, right? Any game engine that we have is always gonna be located in 3D space. Okay, Unity is a 3D engine as well. In a 3D engine, you have 3 directions where you can move in, right? Okay, you have the x-axis, and then the x-axis, if you were to rotate around it, will be like this. And you have the y-axis, and if you were to rotate around the y-axis, it will be like this. And then finally, you have the z-axis, which if you were to rotate around it, will be like this. Okay, so rightfully, right, if you wanted to represent a rotation in 3D space, you are actually able to do so by using a vector 3, because you can actually have 3 values. For example, you want to have an x rotation of say 30 degrees, 90 degrees for y, and then 120 degrees for z. This vector 3, right, can represent rotation. The problem with vector 3s is that you can actually get something called gimbal locks. It's easier for me to show you what is a gimbal lock by going to Microsoft Edge. So let me just head over there and just Google this thing called a gimbal lock. Okay, what is a gimbal lock? Gimbal lock is if you use a vector 3 and represent a rotation, right? You can rotate the vector 3 into such a way where you will lose one axis of rotation. If you were to rotate one of the rings to the other ring, you get something called gimbal lock. And when gimbal locks happen, right, what will happen is that it will be very difficult for you to rotate stuff. If you were to rotate it in a certain way and you lock it up, right, you will have to unlock the gimbal before you are able to start rotating freely again. So around, I think, when I was a student, a lot of softwares were still using vector 3s to represent rotations. So whenever we did animations with objects, let's say in Maya, one common thing that you have is that if you were to lock up the object's gimbal, then the animation for the rotation will happen very weird. So we have to unlock the gimbal first, and then we can continue rotating. Okay, so to rectify this issue, game engines, I think around 2010, they started to use Quaternions to represent rotations instead of using a vector 3. The reason they didn't use Quaternions before is because Quaternions are very difficult to manage. What do I mean by that? So with Quaternions, right, we represent 3D rotations using a 4-dimensional number. So a Quaternion, instead of having 3 values, we have 4 values. And all of these values in the Quaternion, right, are actually less than 1, but they are normalized. Okay, this is a wrong Quaternion because there shouldn't be a 1 inside a Quaternion. So you may have, say, 0.3, 0.2, 0.6, and maybe 0.8. So a Quaternion is always going to be normalized into a value of 1. Okay, if you don't know what that means, that's fine, because it's gonna be difficult to explain normalization in 4D. A Quaternion is just a series of 4 numbers, and you can imagine it as Okay, do you know the number line? Number line is you know, in math class, you have say a line, and then you have like 0, and you have 1, and you have 2, and then you have 3, and then you have 4, and so on, right? Okay, and then you have, of course, here you have -1, -2, -3, and so on. So what happens when you do a square root of -1 is if you were to try and square root of -1, you will get a number called I. This I here is because you cannot square root a negative number, right? If you were to square root something like 4, you will get 2. And this is because 2 times 2 is equals to 4. Okay, so a square root of 4 actually has two numbers. It's actually either 2 or -2. And the reason for this is because -2 times -2 will also give you a 4. So there is no way you can get a solution for a square root of -1, or let's say if I were to get a square root of -9, right? There's no solution for that. You can get a 3 over here, but then you have to put an I behind, because I represents the square root of -1. Because square root of -9 is actually, is it 3i? Okay, I forgot the math for this. It should be 3 times. Yeah, I think this is 3i if I'm not wrong. Okay, I'm sorry if I got the math wrong, but you only need to understand what happens when you do a square root of -1. You get I. And why do we say I? Because if I were to do I times I, this will give me a this will give me -1. Alright, so this is why square root of -1 gives you I. So mathematicians, what they did was they had a lot of trouble, because what they eventually found was that the proper way to represent I is that I is actually an axis over here. Okay, so if what you have in the number line is that you have I over here, and then you have 2i, and then you have 3i, and so on. And then this is -1i and -2i, and so on. So why am I showing you the number line and explaining square roots of -1s to you? Because if I were to have a number at 2, for example, right? Okay, so if I had to have the number 2 and I wanted to perform a rotation of 180 degrees, I would take 2 times -1. This will give me a rotation of 180 degrees. So if I wanted to rotate 90 degrees, I would do 2 times I. This will give me 2i, which will bring me from here to here, which is 90 degrees. So this is how quaternions work. Quaternions are basically a bunch of imaginary numbers like that. So basically what Unity does is, or what quaternion does, is that it stores values like that, imaginary numbers. So if I wanted to rotate, let's say 45 degrees, right? What I would do is I would find a complex number over here, which is, this is probably say 1.4 plus 1.4i. So if I were to get my value of 2 and I rotate this by 1.4 plus 1.4i, this will give me a 45-degree rotation. So you can represent any rotation by using a real number plus a complex number. Sorry, real number plus an imaginary number, which is the I component. So this is how quaternions work. Quaternions work in 4 dimensions. So basically what we have here is we have one more axis here, and this is another line of imaginary numbers, and this is called J. And then we have one more that goes in the 4th dimension, which I'm not able to represent inside this this image over here. But basically a quaternion is basically a value that has you can imagine it as having a real component. So let's say 0.7 plus 0.4i plus 0.3j plus say 0.1k. So this is a complex number with 3 imaginary components, and all of these values are basically, if you square root -1, you will get either I or j or k. The math for that is pretty complex. Okay, so quaternions, if you were to represent quaternions, if you were to represent rotations using quaternions, you will not run into gimbal lock, because they use 4 dimensions to represent a 3-dimensional rotation. And they are very hard to use, which is why they have been avoided. People have avoided using them for so long. And even now, right, in Unity, when you have to use quaternions, you do not have to reference them using imaginary numbers. So usually what we do when we want to create rotations in Unity is, instead of using the Quaternion math that we have here, which is very complex, we use an Euler function to create the rotation instead. So in Unity, a Euler function is provided, and this function allows you to create a quaternion using a regular vector tree. So for example, if I wanted to have a rotation right here, I can just key in the X, the Y, and the Z value. Okay, so for 2D games, right, whenever you want to rotate something, you will always be using the Z value. Why is that? Because if you recall the three axes that we have, right, X, and then we have Y, and then we have Z. All right, so Z always goes in this direction, right? And then where is our screen? Our screen is right here, right? So this is our screen. So then we're always rotating around the screen, right? In a 2D game. And then rotating around the screen is always going to be the Z axis because it goes into the camera. Okay, it's a it's a pretty long explanation, but I hope I answered your question. Did I answer your question? I hope I did. Yeah, I hope it helps you to understand how quaternions work and what you have to do to use them. So okay, one more question from that. For beginners, which is good 2D or 3D, and you're ready to make multiplayer games. Multiplayer games, I would say avoid them first, because you have to deal with replication, which, okay, I have to stay on task here, okay, but replication is basically when you have, you know, when you have multiplayer games, you have server and a host, server and a client. So you have host, and then you have people who are playing, right? So I think right now, everything is, I think you don't really see that nowadays, but if you play Warcraft 3, right, for example, in Warcraft 3 or Counter-Strike, you would have to have a host. In the early 2000s in the LAN shops, you always hear, at least here in Singapore, you always hear people who are playing games. Who's hosting? Who's hosting? And then they'll ask, who has the fastest computer? The fastest computer will be the host. Okay, the reason for that is because the host will be the one who's in charge of managing the game rules, and then the rest of the players are the clients, and then the clients will collect information from the host as to how the game progresses. So what's happening is that whenever you have a multiplayer game, you have to have a host, and the host will manage the game, and then the state of the game has to be replicated over to the clients. So for example, if my character is running, right, the host will be the one calculating my movement speed, and then it has to be replicated over to the client. So to deal with this replication, when you write your code, you have to think about how code works from the server as well as how code works from the client, which is very complex. Nowadays, you don't really see this host and client thing or server and client thing because the newer games, they all provide hosting, so everyone is a client, as opposed to in the past when internet wasn't so good, and then you had to figure out yourself who was the host and who was the client. So which means that now, because all games provide the hosting for you, right, you have to write two sets of codes, one for the hosting and then one for all the players, right, which again, still very complex, and then you just have to deal with replication in a different way. That's the long and short of multiplayer games. So yep, if you have any more questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat. As for me, I'm just gonna carry on where I left off. So I broke into an explanation of Quaternions, right? And before that, I think we just finished discussing the projectile weapon script. So okay, so let me just create the script for projectile weapon. Then just grab this code. I'm gonna put the code inside Unity. So I've just copied the code for projectile weapon. Gonna go to weapons folder. Gonna place the projectile weapon right here. So now that I've copy pasted the code into the projectile weapon folder, I should be able to use it. And the next step for us would be to make use of this projectile weapon. Okay, so I've explained how the attack function works. I've also explained get spawn angle. Everything is really explained in the footage that we have earlier on. Handling multiple projectiles has been explained as well. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is what do we do with this new projectile weapon script? So in the old system, we would have had to create a new weapon controller prefab for every weapon that we have. Okay, but for our new system, all this is going to be automated. How is it going to be automated? It's going to be automated by us going into the weapon data script. Okay, if we look at the weapon data script that we have right here, we actually also have this behavior attribute. And this behavior attribute allows us to control what kind of weapon this is. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Okay, we're gonna be creating a new editor folder inside our project. And then inside this new editor folder, we are going to be creating a new script. And this script will be called WeaponData Editor. And what this WeaponData Editor script does is it allows us to modify how the weapon data is presented to us. If you were to look at the weapon data that we have for our knife, for example, right? Which again, we will move this to a different folder later on. You will see all of these fields over here. If I wanted to customize how the inspector displayed the knife weapon data or weapon data in general, I can code a weapon data editor for it. Okay, this is because the script is called weapon data. So if I were to create a weapon data editor, this will modify how the inspector shows weapon data, the fields inside weapon data. So let me just open up the weapon data code, and then we are going to just head over to the article over here, and then the weapon data script is right here. And then I'm going to just copy the whole thing, and I'll explain what's going on after I copy and paste this inside. Okay, so what we want to do with the weapon data editor is we actually want our weapon data to display a little drop down right here. Okay, so we want our weapon data to display this drop down over here. And this drop down is actually, notice here I have a projectile weapon. This is because we've just created a projectile weapon script like that. Okay, if we were to create more weapon scripts, you will have more options over here. Okay, so right now if I were to select the projectile weapon, you will see this will again display all the stats that the weapon has. Okay, so in the future when we have more kinds of weapons, okay, you will see that we will be able to have more stuff to select. Okay, we will cover how to create all these different weapons in part 16. Okay, so for now what we want is so what this behavior does is that when I create a new weapon, I can right away just go into the weapon data, and then just by selecting the behavior, I'm able to modify how the weapon works. Okay, so if I wanted to create more kinds of weapons, I have to create more weapon classes, and then I will have more weapon classes to select from. Okay, and then of course this behavior will control how the weapon behaves. If I have a projectile weapon, it behaves one way. If I have an aura weapon, it behaves a different way, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so let's go through what's going on in the code. So what we are doing here is we're creating a custom editor, and then that's why it extends the editor class. And then inside the editor class, the main function we want to pay attention to actually is the onInspector GUI. And what we have in our interface here, what we actually want to do is we want to just have the default inspector interface. But we want a little bit of extra. We just want this extra drop down on top. Yeah, and everything else is the default stuff. So the draw default inspector here just draws the default way the inspector is drawn. But then before we do that, right, we will just add a new pop-up. This line here is what adds the pop-up. And the result of the pop-up, so the pop-up has multiple options, right? So the options will go from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So this will be an integer. And then the pop-up's name will be called Behaviour. And then this is the default value of that is gonna go here. And then this is of course this is the options that we have. So then if we select something other than 0, so 0 will be none. So if we select none, nothing shows up. But if we select anything other than 0, then all the stats of the weapon will show. This is why we have this selected weapon subtype more than 0. Then we draw the default inspector below, but before we do that, we have the name of the class that we want. We want to save it inside the behavior field, and then we want to save this because recall that this is actually an asset. So whenever we make modifications to it, we have to save it in our hard drive. And this set30 here allows us to save the weapon data. Okay, so what's going on here is inside the onEnable function. Okay, whenever we select the weapon data, what the editor is gonna do is it's gonna look through the entire code base that we have to find all the subclasses of weapon. Okay, so it finds all the subclasses of weapon and it puts them into an array. Okay, I got this code from ChatGPT. Alright, so I just asked ChatGPT, how do you find, see if I can find the original chat. I asked ChatGPT, can you generate a code that gives me a drop down that shows all the different classes of a particular type? I think that was what I did. Okay, I can't find the chat now, never mind. When we edit the video, we will add the chat in, alright? So, and then we add a none option in front. This will be 0. And then after that, we set the weapon subtype to whatever is set in the weapon data at the moment. Okay, so all this is just logic to create just this drop down right here. Yeah. And with this drop down over here, we can now properly set the knife to be a projectile weapon, and then we can set the rest of the stats. So that's the weapon behavior portion. This is the drop down I was talking about. Okay, so once we have the drop down set up, you can read the article to get the explanation that I just ran through with you. So once the drop down is set up, we want to, okay, we are still a couple of steps away before we can test out the knife, and that is because again there are so many moving parts to our system. The next thing we have to do is create an item superclass, and this item superclass, what it does here is that the item superclass will provide us a parent class that we can subclass weapons and passives. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So if you look at Vampire Survivors game, what we have is we have two kinds of items. We have weapons, and then we also have passive. Passive, or the passive items, right, that we've created. In the past we call them passive items. So the two kinds of items you can have in Vampire Survivors are passives and weapons. So we are going to create a superclass for it, for item, that will store behavior that is shared among the weapon and the passive. And then after that, we will have to create the passive before we are able to test out the system. This is because the system works as a whole. So when we modify the weapons portion of the system, we will also have to recreate the rest of the system before we are able to start using it. So let's copy the item script. And I'm gonna put the item script inside passive items over here. I'm gonna create the obsolete folder over here and then just drop everything inside. Okay, and then I'll create our new item script. The item script will be C# script item. And let me just copy and paste this code inside here, and then we'll go through that. Okay, so what do we want to use with in the item script? We primarily just want to manage the current and the max level. So what we want to do with the item script is, if you look at the weapon script that we have, we had to manage the current level and the max level for the weapon. We want to move this functionality over to the item script. And the reason for this is because later on we're going to create passives, and passives also have a leveling functionality. Okay, so by creating the leveling functionality in item, we will then be able to pass it down to the weapon as well as to the passives that will be created. So item works together with a data set called ItemData, which we will go into later. The other thing that we want to pass over back to item, okay, in the weapon script, we have the owner. We want to pass over the management of the owner to the item script as well. So when we initialize the item, what we're going to do is just retrieve the max level and then find the owner. Okay, both are behaviors that used to be managed by weapon that we are now handing over to the item script. And the other thing that we will be doing is we'll be transferring the can level up function from the weapon over to the item. And then do level up, we will just set this to true. And then the reason we are creating the item class also is because later on we're going to be coding weapon evolution. And then weapon evolution is going to involve items, because both passives and weapons are going to be able to evolve. So we cannot just put the weapon evolution code into the weapon itself. Okay, so I will also go through the intricacies of why we are putting the weapon evolution logic into item and into the weapon itself instead of putting it inside the inventory manager as we've done before. And then finally, under the item class, we also have on equip and on unequip function. These are both functions that automatically fire whenever you add or remove an item from the character's inventory. Okay, again, we'll go into this later. For now, the item class, the main purpose it's gonna serve is just it's gonna be helping us to manage the leveling up of items for our items in the game. So now that we have the item class, okay, that I will get back to you once I finish more of the tutorial, right? Because I'm running out of time. So I'm not able to answer all of your questions. Some of your questions, a lot of your questions actually, they are quite in depth. I will have to give a very long response to them. So if you really want those questions to be answered, what you can do is you can go to our forums. You can leave your questions there, and what I'll do is in the next stream I probably will have more time, and then I will answer your questions in the next stream. Okay. Okay, so let's move on with the tutorial with the article. So after we have created the item class, next thing we want to do is subclass our weapon to item. Okay, what this means is we have to make some modifications to our weapon code. So we will have to replace the mono behavior here with item. We will also have to move some of the codes over So current level, max, and the owner and the max level, we have to move it away. We have to remove these two lines because they are moved over to item as well. And then we will just call the item's initialize function to run these two lines of code on top. And there is can level up, which we are moving to item as well. And then over here, we will have to call the items do level up function, just because we are referring to the, we always want to call the parent function because we want to include the parent's functionality. Okay, there are cases where we don't call the base function, but those cases this is not the case right now. Okay, just I noticed I'm missing a semicolon in my code, so let me just add it in. Just very quickly, let's add the semicolon right here. There we go. Okay, if I didn't add the semicolon, then there will be an error in the code. Okay, so what we are doing in the weapon class is we're just modifying it and removing the variables that have already been declared in item, so that the subclassing works properly. Okay, so if you want to understand a little bit better of how subclassing works, you can refer to the previous tutorials in our series, or there is an article that we have on the blog that you can read through to find. Just search for class. You'll be able to find. Sorry, just search for inheritance. You should be able to find an article about making use of inheritance in game programming. Okay, so you can read this article. We'll leave a link to the article in the description for this video, as well as for our summarized part 15 video as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these modifications to my code. And then this will get my weapon class working. So I'm going to change this to item. I'm going to remove these. It's a duplicate. I'm going to remove this as well because I can just call base.initialize. This is the initialize function of parent class for this functionality right here. What else do I need to change? I will also need to remove can level up because this is provided by the parent. And then for the weapon class, I will have to do an override here. Because I'm overwriting the parent class's function, and then what I'll do is I'm calling the parent function to level up. So I'm basically doing whatever the item class does, but I'm doing a little bit of something extra. And what is the extra thing I'm doing in weapon is I have to manage the stats, because the item doesn't manage the stats for me. Alright? And then of course I'll check if I can level up. And the rest of the code I don't have to modify because the rest of the code is unique to weapon and set. Okay? So one last thing that we have to deal with is if you go to item, you'll see ItemData here has an error. And this is because we have to define the ItemData class as well. And the ItemData class is right here. The ItemData class is again just a parent for the weapon data class, in the same way that the item is a parent for the weapon. Okay, so the ItemData class is just a parent class for all weapons and passive items. And I can just make a copy of it. And let me just create a script to here to contain the new ItemData class. So again, with the ItemData, because we are going to be making it a child, sorry, a parent of weapon data, we have to go to weapon data. And basically ItemData just contains the icon and the max level, which used to be contained by weapon data. So I will just go to weapon data, inherit this from ItemData, and I'll remove these two attributes over here. And that about wraps up the subclassing of WeaponData into ItemData and weapon into item. Okay, so why are we subclassing item and ItemData? Or rather, why are we making a superclass of item and ItemData and subclassing my weapon and WeaponData classes? The reason is because we have to create passives. And the passives are there to represent our passive items. Okay, so in our old system, we have a bunch of passives. So we have like wings, we have spinach and everything, right? Okay, so if you go to passive items, you go to scriptable object, passive items, you have wings, and then you have the wings passive. And then you have spinach and spinach passive. So what we also have is we have the prefabs for the passive items as well. And what the prefabs do is that the prefabs just has a script. So again, for passives, right, let's say if I have a wings item, right, and then I have let's say 8 levels of wings, I will have 16 objects because I will have 8 scriptable objects and I will have 8 prefabs. And this is not a sustainable and scalable way of doing things, because to have these many items is going to become very cumbersome, very difficult to use our code. So we subclassed weapon and weapon data into item and item data so that we can later also use the item data and item classes as a parent class for our passive and our passive data classes, okay, which is what we are doing right here. So what I'm saying essentially is that with the passive system, we want to do the same thing as we have done for the weapon system. So we have to create the passives and the weapons before we can create the inventory manager, and then we can overhaul our and before we can overhaul our whole inventory system. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit tongue-tied over here. Be talking for 2.5 hours straight. Okay, I'm just gonna take a short break to go and drink some water, and I'll be right back. Right, so stay tuned. I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Just a very quick one. Okay, that just to answer your question, right? The underwater project is not a full tutorial. We have discontinued that because we don't get a lot of views on that and it takes a lot of work. So after I'm done with the Vampire Survivor series, once we have a full set of files, then I will take a look at the underwater asset. So I'm not a sole developer. I have people who are working with me. So I have someone who's editing the videos for me, and I also have people who are helping me do web development stuff. Which I manage web development projects as well, and I also have people who are helping me to. So we also sell assets on the asset store, and we are doing some work on that as well. So there's quite a few things I'm working with. Okay, I'll see you guys in 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll finish up this part of the tutorial series by 4 p.m. in my time. That's about, I don't know, one and a half hours that we have. We'll finish everything up in the last 1.5 hours.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Oh, this you crazy mother.
Okay, let me redo everything again. Sorry, I was muted. So what we just did, let's just have a refresher. So we just created a new passive class, and then I've also created a new PassiveData class. And what these two classes are supposed to do is, for now, they do nothing. Okay, they are just there to provide a class for us to use, because in our inventory manager, our new inventory manager script, if you look at the PassiveData class, there's nothing inside. Okay, that's because we are creating these classes so that we are able to create our new PlayerInventory script. And then in our new PlayerInventory script, we have a couple of variables as compared to the inventory manager script, which was our old script, which had a lot of variables. So we're gonna do the same thing with our PlayerInventory script, but with lesser number of variables. So part of the reason why we're able to reduce the number of variables in the PlayerInventory script is because we have created a weapon and weapon data class that handles the stats and the levels and everything. So if you notice, the levels are actually baked into the weapons themselves, so we don't have to store the levels of the weapons separately in our inventory manager anymore. And then we're also merging the UI slots and the weapon slots together, as well as the weapon levels, everything into one variable here, which was what I was drawing over here. Let me just draw everything. So these three variables are going to be merged into weapon slots, and then these three variables are going to be merged into passive slots. And then available weapons and available passives, they are still the same. It's just the rename of these two variables. And finally, we have upgrade UI options, which is right here. And then of course, we also have the weapon evolutions variable. So in the past, the weapon evolutions used to be handled by the inventory manager. We're gonna move this into the item class later, and I'll explain why this is a better way of doing things. Alright. So our new inventory manager script is gonna be a lot simpler to manage, a lot more readable as well, a lot easier to read. And the weapon evolutions field that we had in the past, okay, that was it's right here. So in the past, if you wanted to create weapon evolutions, you would slot them all under weapon evolutions, and then you would have to create a new weapon evolution blueprint, and then you would have to slot everything inside here. Okay, so this is pretty a little bit complicated. So what we're gonna do is later we're gonna go back to the item class, and we're gonna add another field called evolution data that will contain all the information about all the weapons that a particular weapon that we have can evolve to. So an example that is given here is the aura weapon that we have, that I will show you how to create later, just a very quick setup. Okay, the aura weapon over here. Okay, so the garlic, the aura weapon is for the garlic. Garlic evolves into the soul eater and it uses Palmarola. So it needs to be level 8. The Palmarola needs to be level 5. And then the outcome of the evolution is you get a soul eater that is level 1. And then there's also a couple of conditions and consumption conditions that I will talk about more later on when we get to weapon evolution. Okay, so here is the play inventory script again. Play inventory script is meant to simplify the player inventory component that we have. It used to be inventory manager, so we are renaming it and calling it play inventory. Okay, so we'll go to Unity and then we'll just create a new script under player, and let's call this player inventory. Okay, and then I'm gonna create a new obsolete folder. Where is my folder? Obsolete. And I'll drop my inventory manager inside here. And you also want to label it obsolete, but okay, let me just very quickly do it. So you want to do that for all the codes that are replaced. This has been replaced by player inventory. So what this will do is that if you put this obsolete message, again, if you go back to Unity itself, and if you were to go to the player game object, and you will see inventory manager here, there's a notice here that says this has been replaced by player inventory. So okay, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a while. So we have the new play inventory script, and we are going to have to copy the codes for play inventory over into our codes. Let me just grab the codes over here. So let's just run through what the play inventory script does for us. Okay, so we have a couple of errors inside the play inventory script that we are gonna have to show up before we're able to use it. Okay, but the play inventory script, okay, the main thing that's inside the play inventory script is this struct over here. and it's called a slot. Okay, and what the slot contains is it contains item. So recall that because item is a superclass of weapon and passive, if I set the slot to have an item, it's able to contain either a weapon or a passive. So the other thing that it contains is an image. Okay, this is because if you recall in our original inventory script, we have the inventory manager right here. Then the inventory manager actually has a reference to all the UI slots. What are the UI slots? Okay, if you just a recap of what we have done in the past sessions. Alright, UI slots are these 6 inventory slots that we have. Alright, so the inventory manager has to reference these slots so that it can put in the items icon whenever we get a new item. Okay, so we have to, when we create the new slot struct here, it's meant to contain the item as well as the image so that we don't have to split them up into multiple variables. And then we also have an assign function inside the slot struct, and this assign function over here basically checks if it's a weapon, it will assign it to a particular. If it's a weapon, it will handle it a certain way. If it's a passive, it will handle it a certain way, and then you will assign the item to the slot. And there is also a clear function. What a clear function does is it removes the item from the slot, and there is a isEmpty function that checks whether the slot is empty or whether the slot is not empty. Okay, so this slot here is the main crux of changes. Okay, if you read through the article, you will find the same thing. Okay, the PlayerInventory slot over here is the slot class. Okay, we have in the slot class, these two are the main variables you want to pay attention to. Okay, and then it's in the PlayerInventory class so that we are able to define these variables over here. Okay, if you look inside the PlayerInventory script, we define 2 variables, weapon slots and passive slots, and then it uses a slot struct. Okay, and if you were to look inside the weapon and the passive slots, you will find let me just fix the errors inside here for temporarily so I can show you how the slots look like. Okay, so I'm gonna run through the code over here. And there are a couple of errors that I have to handle, right? So this would be data dot name, I think. And then this will be, we will have to leave out the recalculate stats over here, over here, and passive modifiers as well, which are over here and over here. Okay, so let's get, oh, I can't remove these, huh? Okay, let me just comment out this part of the code here first, so that I can just show you how the PlayerInventory script looks like. Okay, so what we have here is what we're aiming to do here is we want to replace the inventory manager with our new PlayerInventory script. And the new PlayerInventory script is a lot easier to use because what we will have to do with the new PlayerInventory script is, let me just move my face away so that I can show the inspector. Okay, for the weapon slots, we just have to add 6 slots. And then same thing for the passive slots. So we can just add 6 slots for both the passives as well as the weapon. And then we just have to leave the item empty for each of the slots. And then we will just have to assign the individual slots here like that. So once we assign all these individual slots, we can start using the inventory manager. So then for the available weapon and available passive, so we need to do is, let's say we have a whole bunch of weapons, we just have to assign the scriptable objects for each of the weapons. So under the inventory manager, sorry, play inventory here, let's say I have a whole bunch of weapons, right? Where are my weapons? It's under weapons. So let's say if I have the knife, and let's say in the future we have garlic and everything, I just assign all these different available weapons, and then on level up, the weapons will become selectable by the player. So same thing for the passives. And then for the upgrade UI options, this will just be the same as the old inventory manager script. Okay, this UI options, right? I can just copy the entire thing over here and then just paste it here. Yeah, to make use of it. So these are just the elements that you find over here. So we have 4 slots over here, right? So the upgrade UI options, it's meant to refer to these 4 slots. And so that's about it for the play inventory script. There are a couple of issues that we have to fix before we can start using it. And this has to do with some missing functions inside the passives class. So just give me a moment to fix this in the article, and then we'll continue on with the review of the code. So under the just give me a moment to review all this stuff. So I'll just show you what I'm looking at right now. Upgrade UI options interface. Okay, so one thing that I forgot to mention in play inventory is that in inventory manager we use these functions to add weapons and passives. So these 2 functions have been replaced with a new function called add in play inventory that allows you to add either passives or weapons. And so the problem with the old functions is that whenever you wanted to add a new weapon or you wanted to add a new passive, you would have to check whether a slot was empty by yourself. So the inventory manager doesn't check the slot for you. So if you were to assign a weapon onto a slot that is already occupied, the weapon will just replace the other weapon, which is a problem, right? So what you want to do is you want to be able to explicitly add and remove passives when you call your functions. Okay, so these 2 functions were cumbersome to use because you have to check the slots yourself. Okay, so this was done in the inventory manager with the spawn weapon function. Sorry, in PlayerStats. This is from PlayerStats. There is a spawn weapon function that had to check whether the inventory slot was empty before it used add weapon to add the weapon into the script. So with the play inventory script, the add function over here automatically helps you to find an empty slot and add the item. So then you didn't have to check the slots anymore. So this means that in our player stats that we're going to be modifying later, we do not have to use the spawn weapon function anymore. We can just use play inventory .add, and then this will add the weapon for us. Okay, so the spawn weapon function in PlayerStats is supposed to be helping us to add a new starting weapon. So we don't need this function anymore because now the play inventory script has a more efficient way for us to do that. Okay, we also have a remove function that we will be able to use later when we have weapon evolution. Okay, what this does is just removes an item for us. Okay, if you notice in Vampire Survivors, when a weapon evolves, the old weapon is removed. The passive is not removed, but the old weapon is removed. So we need a remove function that we use to remove our items later on. So the rest of the functions in PlayerInventory behave similarly to their counterparts. So not all the functions have been changed. Some of the functions have been updated. And then the weapon evolution functions have been removed. So in the inventory manager script, the evolve weapon and get possible evolutions functions were used because the inventory manager was responsible for evolving our weapons. Okay, this has all been removed because later we're gonna move these functionalities into the item class. Okay, so the play inventory script for now, it doesn't work because we are missing a couple of codes. Okay, let me just modify the error inside the play inventory script before I move on. So this one here would be error is, where is the error? Error is line 225. Okay, component, this will be data.net. Oh wait, sorry. I don't think this should be fine. So later on when we set up the passive, I think the passive has a set of base stats if I'm not wrong. Oh yeah, so it has a set of base stats. There's a little typo that we have over here as well. So let me just jump over there and modify, and then we'll continue with this. This shouldn't be HTML, this shouldn't be HTML, so it shouldn't be showing up. Okay, there we go. Okay, let's continue. We have quite a few more things to go through. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is, so we have a couple of things that we've just created, right? If we were to go back to Unity, we will find that we've created a passive data as well as a weapon data. Alright, so we can create either passives or we can create weapons. Alright, and then when we create them, we can just assign them to the play inventory. And then this will allow us to add them as weapons or as passives that we are able to access. So the next thing we want to do is we will want to just go to player the player folder, and then we will want to modify the character scriptable object right here into a format that we're able to use. So this will be a pretty quick edit, because if we go to our character scriptable object, you will find a whole bunch of variables that you can mess around with, but there's only one thing that you have to change. Okay, let me just open it up over here. Character scriptable object. So we just have to change the starting weapon so that it doesn't use a game object anymore, because we just want to be able to assign the weapon data, and then the inventory manager will help us to add the weapon for us. So the only thing we gotta change from the character scriptable object really is this field, and then the rest of the fields are more or less the same. Okay, so if you were to compare these two scripts, you'll find that the only thing different is here. Alright, so let's grab this code that we have, and I'm gonna move character scriptable object into the obsolete folder as well. Then over here, I will create a new script called CharacterData, and this will be a scriptable object. And the character data doesn't need to have character data, where is character data? So the character data doesn't need to have the there's some extra fields over here we don't need. Okay, so what's inside the character data file? Besides, so there are a couple of changes over here, so we don't need this. So besides changing the starting weapon to use weapon data instead of a game object, we also have a stats object over here. This stats object over here is very similar to the one that we created for weapon. Alright, so in the character data struct, what we have is we have a list of stats, and this list of stats basically are the stats that a player character can have. So if you were to look at the let me see. So if you were to look at there's a link somewhere over here, but I can't find it, so never mind. Let me just vampire survivors character stat. So every character has a set every character has a set of stats. For example, you have max health, you have health regeneration, you have armor, you have move speed, etc, etc. So there are 17 stats that you can find inside Vampire Survivors. So what we want to do is we want to create a stats struct inside character data that we will be using to manage the stats of the characters. Okay, so these stats data will be used also to calculate things like damage or like the character's move speed and so on. Okay, so this stat struct is similar to the weapons stat struct because it will be used as a variable in a couple of places later on. So passives is one of the places we'll be using this stats object as well. So what this does is that we will be changing our character data's inspector from storing the stats outside separately here like that into basically we have a stats attribute or the stats variable here, and we will have the max health and might and speed and magnet and everything. Okay, so notice also we've only implemented 6 stats. So as we move along and we start to flesh out this weapon system a little bit more, we'll be adding the rest of the stats. And then with that, we will also be this array will just increase, and then we will still be able to use everything that we have inside here. Okay, everything here will still be usable. It's just that it's now a lot more flexible, and then we're gonna use this stats data for our passives as well. Okay, so now that we have the character data stats, we're able to use that as a variable type. So in the stats struct, you will see something called a constructor here as well. So what this constructor does is that it just allows us to basically, when we create new character stats, we will be able to fill it up with default values. Okay, I will show you this later on in the stream. So there's this notice about other stats just talked about. So later on, we're gonna add more items into the stats struct so that we can account for these other stats. Okay, and then we also have a plus operator definition here to show you how you can add the stats together. So this again is for say when you have boosts to the character stats, you can just have two character data stats object. You can add them together, and then this will increase the stats of the player character. Okay, this will be used later for passives as well, because passives will increase the stats of the player. So now that you have done that, we should be able to create new character data assets for all your characters. Okay, there's a bit of a problem with the PlayerInventory script. So I will be modifying this article later so that we are able to create this character data. So now, because my scripts cannot compile, I'm not able to create new character data objects. Alright, unless I remove the player inventory script, okay, which I will not do. So later on when we edit this video, we will have to record some new footage to show you how the character data object works. Okay, so we will have to update player stats to use player inventory as well. So for this one over here, what we want to do is for player stats, we just have to modify it so that instead of using character scriptable object, we will be using the character data variable instead. And then we will also modify how the player stats script manages the player stats. So instead of having instead of having all the stats be separate variables, we will have the player stats here be split into two parts: base stats and then actual stats. The reason for managing it this way is because the base stats are very important, because whenever we remove passives, or whenever we add passives, or whenever we have power-ups in the future and we gain and lose power-ups, the stats will keep changing. So if we do not have a copy of the base stats, we will not be able to calculate what the current stats of our character is. So by having base stats and actual stats, we will basically, the base stats are just there so that we can recalculate the stats as and when we need. And the actual stats are the stats that are recalculated. So this replaces the 6 stats variables that we have for player stats. The health variable over here is still there because we don't have a max health stat. So the health is just store the current health, and then it's there to check if the player lives or dies. So then we have over here, this section over here is just the same as before. Okay, so these are just variables that we use to set the health. So because I renamed the current health variable to health, over here we have to change this all to from current health to health. That's all the change there is. And then the rest of these changes over here, these are basically just changing where we retrieve the max health. So what these are basically getters and setters. And then basically what I've done is that even though we've removed the variables over here, we are still keeping the getters and setters for these old variables. Again, this is to maintain compatibility with the code. In the future, we are going to look into how we can clean up this section over here. Okay, but for now, we will have to just work with whatever we have, because if I change too many things, a lot of the other codes are gonna break, and then this will cause this part to become longer. So that's what we don't want, which is why we are just keeping things as they are now. So the rest, we update the play inventory, we update the inventory manager to play inventory. So it's just the same variable, just a different type. And then for the character selector, I will go through this later. We are just updating this so that the function call is shorter, but then we will have to update the character selector so that this function is called differently as well. And then we are removing the setting of the stats, and then now we are just setting the stats by because we are able to set the stats just by retrieving it from character data stats and then assigning it to base stats. Reason for that is because the base stats and the actual stats over here use character data stats, which is why we can do that. And finally, we add the starting weapon. We no longer need to use spawn weapon. And then we have to update the values over here because we've removed the original variables, right? So we have to use the getters and the setters now. And then finally, we just add an empty recalculate stats so that we get the player inventory working because the player inventory calls this function. And finally, what's the last thing we are doing here? The last thing we're doing here is we are just adding a little destroy function here. This is because when we spawn an effect and we don't destroy, it leaves a memory leak. And that's about all for the changes. I think there is one more change here. We just change this to the actual stats. So when we manipulate the health, we just want to remove the max health, and then we want to use the this variable no longer exists, right? Anyway, because the max health stat is able to be modified by passives, so we have to get the actual stats instead of using the character data stats, which is static. Let me just notice an error in the thing that's written here. Give me a moment. Okay, there we go. Now corrected the errors over here. Okay, there are two more errors that I haven't corrected. Just let me rectify those as well. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let me just apply these changes to my current PlayerStats script. I'm gonna be working out a thing where we can click on this PlayerStats, and then this will copy all the code minus the cancelled out code. But It's not been done yet, we're halfway through that. So once this is done, you should find it a lot easier to be able to copy and paste the edited codes. So for now, let me just modify my player stats so that it uses the new classes that we just created. So it no longer uses character scriptable object, it uses CharacterData. So we can remove this, and then we replace all the stats with just health. So these stats are all just health now. With current health, this is what we do. We define current health. We don't check the current health here. References to current health. Just tab 1 back. And current recovery, same thing. So for the rest of the codes, I'm just gonna copy them from here all the way. For the inventory manager, we gotta update it as well, so it uses the player inventory instead. And character selector, replace this with the old functions. Okay, we have to update the character selector later on before this works. This will be player inventory. And then we will have to update this section as well. And then we have base stats. Assign the base stats. Oh, my bad. All this shouldn't be here. This should be all at the bottom. That. And the base stats will be, you remove the spawn weapon over here, so the base stats will be the last line. And we spawn the weapon in start. And this is all updated. Recalculate stat, just add this inside here. We add it inside so that the player inventory can use recalculate stats. And everything else is the same. Just gotta update the update health bar and the restore health and recover. Just give me a moment there. So for update health bar, this will be so that's health. And then we can remove this line. Line is no longer needed. And then again, actual stats, max health, actual stats, health, actual stats, max health. So paste everything here. And we can just comment this line out as well. This line out as well. This will refer to passive slot because player inventory no longer has the passive item slots variable. And now we just have to head over to character selector and update the code there as well, because it has to use the new classes. So let's go to character selector, and then we just gotta change this character scriptable object to CharacterData. And then this, we just make it not static so that it just returns the character data. Okay, so the player selector script, we will need to add some extra code over here. Oh, this is static. Okay, my bad. This means I'll need to, if this is static, then, sorry, made a mistake here. This should just copy the code here. What's happening here is this remains static. And what we're gonna do here is, why is this still a character scriptable object? Oh, it's because, sorry, so this should be character data as well. And this should return a character data as well. So we just gotta update the character selector to remove all references to character scriptable object and update it with character data. And finally, for destroy singleton, we can so what I'm doing here is I'm adding a check. So this removes an error that will occur in the console. So we only try and destroy the instance if there is already an existing instance. We don't always try and destroy everything, because these two lines cause errors, so this is just a minor optimization that we are making. And finally, we've got almost everything up. There are still a couple of issues that we have with the passive that I probably will need to modify the guide to get to. Let me think, how am I going to do this? So now that we've got character data set up, we can replace the inventory manager. The play inventory has some errors, right? Okay, let's remove this. And just give me a moment, yeah. So there are a couple of errors that I think the guide didn't accommodate for. So what I might have to do is I might have to end this stream a little bit early, modify the guide, and then come back, because I'm gonna have to rethink the ordering of the codes and everything. So so the issue that we have is with the guide, right? The part over here with PlayerStats. Sorry, not PlayerStats. The part with the PlayerInventory wasn't very well designed. So because there are quite a few errors over here, if you were to follow the guide by reading the article, you will get stuck. But after copying the PlayerInventory script, so I'm gonna have to go back and rethink this a little bit, then modify the guide, and then come back with another coding review in the next week when we do the stream then. So okay, you know what? Since we are going to stop the coding review here and continue next week, let me just look at the chat and then we can see if there are any questions that need answering. So Deb, I'm not sure what you mean by the health system. So the health system, basically in Vampire Survivors, we have max health and we have health, right? So if you get the passive that boosts your health, it actually boosts your max health. So you have to track both the max health and the current health, and then whenever you take damage, it's the current health. Whenever you heal, it affects the current health as well. So the max health is the only stat that you store, because when you create a new character, you only need to know the max health, because the current health is always equal to the max health. If that makes sense to you. The other question that you have is, am I in GitHub? Yes, we use GitHub to manage the project, which is why we're able to roll back and jump forward, which is why I'm able to recreate this whole thing with you. So okay, so tell you guys what, so I'm gonna end this stream a little bit early this time. I'm gonna correct some issues that we have in the article, and then we'll continue from part 8 and the next stream. So then we can just recap this whole thing again. So with this stream, what I'm also doing is I'm creating footage for part 15 of the Vampire Survivor series. So once we have both streams up, then we will be cutting the videos and everything to get a coherent video, and then using the footage to release part 15. So the reason we are doing it this way is because if we were to record everything manually, it's gonna take us a lot of time. So just using stream footage and stitching everything together will help us to release the video for the next part a lot faster. So in the meantime, for those of you who have looked at the article for part 15, leave us comments if you run into any trouble or if you find any errors. So what I'm gonna do again, I'm gonna end the stream a little bit earlier. I'm gonna go and modify the codes in the article a little bit so that they become more coherent, and then we will finish up the coding review for part 15 in the next week. So thanks for joining us on this. Thanks for joining me on this stream. Happy New Year to everyone. And yeah, so just I'll keep you guys posted for the next part of the series, as well as any other developments that we might have using YouTube. We'll make some announcements over there. So happy new year to you guys. I'll see you next week. We'll continue this coding review again. Bye that. So if you have any questions that I didn't manage to answer, just head over to the forums and just make a post there. I'll answer your questions in the next stream.